The scream tore through the corridor, before Alira even reached the castle gates. She froze, her hand still gripping the strap of her worn travel bag, as two guards dragged a young woman across the courtyard by her arms. The woman was sobbing, begging for mercy in a language Alira barely understood, while a tall man in dark armor watched from the top of the stone steps with no expression at all. That man was King Draven. Alira had heard stories about him on the long journey north. They said he never smiled. They said his eyes could freeze a lake in the middle of summer. They said he had buried 3 advisors who dared question his orders, though no one ever explained what happened to them, only that they were never seen again. She had told herself the stories were exaggerated, the way stories about powerful men always are. Now, watching him stand still as stone while a woman wept before him, she was no longer sure. "You," he said, and his voice cut through the courtyard like a blade through silk. "Are you the one from Ashwood Pack?" Alira's throat went dry. She had traveled for 6 days to reach this castle, carrying nothing but a letter from her pack Alpha, and a promise that her arrival would settle a debt owed to the crown. She had expected a cold welcome. She had not expected to arrive in the middle of someone's punishment. "Yes, my lord," she managed. "I am Alira." Draven descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing off the stone walls. Up close, he was even more intimidating than the rumors suggested. His shoulders were broad enough to block the sun behind him, and his eyes, when they finally landed on her, were the color of storm clouds rolling in before a violent rain. He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to determine what use she could possibly be to him. "Your pack owes the crown 3 years of unpaid tribute," he said flatly. "You are the payment." The words hit her like a physical blow, though she kept her spine straight, and her chin lifted. She had known this, of course. Her Alpha had explained it to her the night before she left, his voice thick with shame he tried to hide. Ashwood Pack was small, poor, and surrounded by wealthier packs that had slowly swallowed its territory over the years. When the debt to the Alpha King finally came due, there had been no gold left to pay it, only a daughter. "I understand my purpose here," Alira said quietly. Something flickered behind Draven's eyes, something she couldn't name, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He turned to a servant hovering nearby, an older woman, with kind eyes and a nervous manner. "Give her the smallest room in the east wing," Draven said. "Near the servants' quarters. She is not a guest." The servant hesitated, glancing between the king and the young woman standing rigid in the courtyard. "My lord, surely there is a more suitable." "The smallest room," Draven repeated, and there was no room for argument in his tone. He turned and walked away without another word, his dark cloak sweeping behind him like a shadow detaching itself from the castle walls. Alira watched him go, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and something else she refused to name. Humiliation, perhaps, or defiance. The servant, whose name Alira would later learn was Myrna, gently touched her arm. "Come, dear, let's get you settled." The room they gave her was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small wooden chest, and a single window that looked out over the servants' garden, instead of the mountains beyond. The walls were bare stone, cold even in the afternoon light, and the door didn't quite close properly, leaving a small gap that let in drafts from the hallway. Alira set her bag down on the bed, and looked around the space that was to be her new life. It was smaller than the room she'd shared with her younger sister back home. Smaller than the storage closet in her pack's meeting hall. She had been told she was coming to a castle, and in her most foolish moments during the journey, she had allowed herself to imagine something different. Not luxury exactly, just dignity. This was not dignity. This was a message. But Alira had not survived the collapse of her pack's fortune, the death of her mother 2 winters ago, and the long, uncertain years that followed by being someone who broke easily. She sat down on the narrow bed, closed her eyes, and allowed herself exactly 1 minute to feel the weight of everything that had happened. Then she stood, unpacked her small bag, and began to make the tiny room as much her own as she could. That evening, Myrna brought her a simple meal of bread, cheese, and a thin vegetable stew. It was far less than what Alira imagined the king and his court were eating in the great hall, but she thanked the older woman sincerely. "You're kinder than I expected," Myrna said, settling onto the edge of the bed as Alira ate. "Most who arrive here as tribute spend their first days crying, or cursing the king's name. Would it change anything if I did?" Myrna's mouth twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. No, it would not. Then I'll save my energy for something more useful. Myrna studied her for a long moment, something like respect settling into her weathered features. The king is not cruel without reason, if that comforts you at all. He lost people he trusted. It changed him. It doesn't comfort me, Alira admitted, but thank you for telling me. Over the following days, Alira began to understand the rhythm of castle life from the shadows she had been assigned to occupy. She was not a servant, not exactly, but she was given small tasks to keep her occupied, mending torn linens, helping in the kitchen gardens, assisting Myrna with the endless administrative work that kept a castle running. No one explained what her ultimate purpose was meant to be. She was tribute, but tribute for what, exactly, remained unclear. She caught glimpses of King Draven throughout the castle, always from a distance. He moved through his own home like a man carrying an invisible weight, his jaw perpetually tight, his eyes distant, even when he was speaking directly to someone. The other members of his court, the advisors and warriors who filled the great hall each evening, treated him with a mixture of loyalty and quiet fear. No one laughed too loudly when he was nearby. No one made unnecessary eye contact. Alira began to notice things others might have missed. The way Draven's hand would sometimes drift to a scar on his forearm when certain topics arose in council meetings, a scar that looked far too deliberate to be an accident of battle. The way his eyes would linger on the empty seat at the head table during formal dinners, a seat that no one ever explained. The way the youngest pack members in the castle avoided him entirely, scattering like startled birds whenever he entered a room. Whatever had happened to make him this way, it had happened before she arrived, and it had left scars far deeper than the one on his arm. 10 days after her arrival, Alira was carrying a basket of freshly washed linens through the east corridor when she heard raised voices coming from the small courtyard just outside. She paused, curiosity getting the better of her caution, and peered around the corner. A young stable boy, no older than 12, was cowering before a broad-shouldered warrior Alira recognized as one of Draven's personal guards. The boy had apparently allowed one of the king's prized horses to escape its pen, and the guard was shouting at him with a level of fury that seemed wildly disproportionate to the offense. "Do you have any idea what that horse is worth?" the guard bellowed, grabbing the boy roughly by the collar. "I should have you thrown out of this castle without a coin to your name." The boy was trembling, tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face, too frightened to even speak in his own defense. Alira felt something hot and protective flare in her chest, an instinct she hadn't expected to still possess after everything her own family had endured. She set down her basket and stepped into the courtyard. "He's just a child," she said, her voice steady, despite the way her heart was pounding. "The horse wasn't harmed. I saw it grazing peacefully near the eastern wall not 10 minutes ago." The guard turned to her, his expression shifting from fury to surprise to something that looked dangerously close to contempt. "This isn't your concern, girl. Go back to whatever corner you've been assigned." "It's my concern when I'm watching a grown man terrorize a child over a mistake that caused no real harm," Alira replied, refusing to back down despite every instinct telling her to. "Is this how the crown treats those who serve it? With cruelty over small errors?" The courtyard had gone very quiet. The Galera became aware, with a sinking feeling, that several other servants and guards had gathered near the edges of the space, watching the confrontation unfold with wide eyes. This was, she realized too late, exactly the kind of scene that could get her sent home in disgrace, or worse. "You dare speak to me this way?" The guard's grip on the boy's collar tightened. "I dare speak to anyone this way, when I see injustice happening in front of me," Alira said, though her voice shook slightly now. "Let him go, please. That's enough." The voice came from behind her, low and commanding, and the entire courtyard seemed to still at once. Alira turned to find King Draven standing at the edge of the space, his storm-gray eyes moving between her, the guard, and the trembling stable boy. The guard released the boy immediately, straightening into a posture of rigid respect. "My king, the boy allowed one of your horses to escape its pen. I heard what you were simply doing," Draven said, his tone deceptively calm in a way that made even Alira's skin prickle with unease. "Release the child and return to your post. We will discuss appropriate discipline for stable errors at a time and place that does not involve terrifying a 12-year-old boy," in front of half the castle staff. The guard's face flushed, with something between shame and anger, but he did not argue. He released the boy fully, offered a stiff bow, and stalked away without another word. The stable boy, still trembling, mumbled a broken thank you, before scurrying off in the opposite direction, disappearing toward the stables as quickly as his small legs could carry him. That left Alira standing alone in the courtyard with the Alpha King, the gathered onlookers slowly dispersing now that the drama had concluded, though several still cast curious glances over their shoulders as they went. Draven studied her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was something sharp in his gaze. It also wasn't approval. It was closer to genuine surprise, as if she had done something he hadn't anticipated anyone in his castle doing in a very long time. "You have a habit of inserting yourself into situations that don't concern you," he said finally. "With respect, my lord, I disagree," Alira replied, meeting his eyes despite the way her pulse hammered in her throat. "A child being frightened half to death over a small mistake concerns anyone with a conscience." "Careful," he said, though there was no real heat behind the word. "That kind of talk could be considered insolence, coming from someone in your position. Then perhaps my position should change. Or perhaps insolence is simply honesty that makes people uncomfortable." For a moment, something almost like the ghost of amusement crossed his features. Though it vanished so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it entirely. He looked at her for a long moment longer, as if reconsidering an assessment he'd made the day she arrived, then turned and walked away without another word, his cloak sweeping behind him as it always did. Alira let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and returned to collect her forgotten basket of linens, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation had passed. She had no idea what consequences might follow from speaking so boldly to the king, but for the first time since arriving at this cold, imposing castle, she felt something other than fear or resignation. She felt, for just a moment, like herself again. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind rattle against her small window, Alira thought about the strange flicker of expression she'd seen in Draven's eyes. Everyone in the castle spoke of him as though he were carved from the same stone as the walls around them, unmoving and untouchable. But she had seen something else today, something that suggested the ice covering him ran deep, but perhaps not all the way through. She didn't know why the thought comforted her, given that she had no reason to care what kind of man the Alpha King truly was beneath his cold exterior. She was tribute, a debt paid in flesh rather than gold, nothing more. And yet, as sleep finally claimed her, her last thought was not of home, or of her worried sister, or even of the uncertain future stretching ahead of her in this unfamiliar place. Her last thought was of storm-gray eyes, and the strange, unexpected warmth she thought she'd glimpsed hiding somewhere within them. The following morning, Myrna arrived at Alira's door earlier than usual, her expression a curious mixture of concern and barely contained curiosity. "The whole castle is talking about you," she said without preamble, settling a tray of breakfast items on the small wooden chest that served as Alira's only furniture besides the bed. Alira sat up, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Talking about what, exactly?" "About how you stood up to Garen in the courtyard yesterday. About how you spoke to the king himself, as though you were his equal rather than a debt he's collecting on." Myrna's eyes were wide with a kind of nervous excitement. "No one does that, dear. No one." "I only said what needed saying," Alira replied, though her stomach twisted with fresh anxiety at the reminder of how reckless her actions might have been. "Is he angry? Will there be consequences?" Myrna hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know what the king is thinking. I've served in this castle for 11 years, and I've never once been able to predict what goes on behind those eyes of his. But I will say this. He didn't punish you. He didn't send you away. And in this castle, that alone is worth noting." Alira turned the words over in her mind, long after Myrna left to attend to her other duties. She didn't know what to make of Draven's restraint, whether it suggested something meaningful about his character, or simply reflected his indifference to a servant girl's small act of defiance. She told herself it was likely the latter. It was safer to believe that. But over the following weeks, small things began to shift, in ways Alira couldn't quite explain. She noticed Draven's presence more often than seemed coincidental. He would appear in the corridor near the small garden where she helped tend vegetables, standing at a distance, with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the workers without ever approaching. He would be seated at council meetings she happened to be passing, and his eyes would lift briefly toward the door as she walked by, though he never called out to her or acknowledged her presence in any obvious way. It might have meant nothing. Castles were small worlds after all, and it was natural that paths would cross more often than either party intended. But Alira found herself paying closer attention to these moments than she probably should have, cataloging them in a private corner of her mind she refused to examine too closely. One afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after her confrontation in the courtyard, Alira was returning from the kitchen gardens with a basket of fresh herbs when she found her path blocked by a group of young pack warriors lounging near the entrance to the servants' quarters. They were laughing loudly among themselves, clearly having consumed more ale than the hour warranted, and their eyes turned toward her with an unwelcome kind of interest as she approached. "Well, look who it is," one of them said, stepping directly into her path. He was tall, with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd rarely faced consequences for his behavior. The little tribute girl who thinks she can lecture the king. Alira kept her expression neutral, though her grip tightened on her basket. "I'd like to pass, please." "What's your hurry?" another warrior chimed in, moving to flank her other side. "We just want to talk." "I don't," Alira said firmly, trying to step around them, but the first warrior shifted to block her again, his smile turning sharper. "Come now. A pretty thing like you, all alone in that tiny room every night. Doesn't that get lonely?" Alira's heart began to pound, fear and anger warring in her chest, as she realized how isolated this corner of the courtyard truly was, how few witnesses remained at this hour. "I said I'd like to pass. And I said we just want to talk," the warrior repeated, reaching out to grip her arm. "Remove your hand," a voice cut through the courtyard, cold enough to freeze the air itself, "before I remove it for you." The warriors froze instantly, their bravado evaporating, as King Draven emerged from the shadowed archway leading toward the main hall. His storm-gray eyes had gone nearly black with barely restrained fury, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides as he crossed the courtyard with long, purposeful strides. The warrior released Alira's arm as though it had burned him, stumbling backward with the others as they scrambled to offer hasty, terrified apologies. "My king, we meant no." "Leave," Draven said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "All of you, now." The warriors fled without another word, disappearing into the castle's interior so quickly that Alira almost felt sorry for the terror she'd witnessed on their faces. Almost. Draven turned to her once they were gone, his expression still tight with controlled anger, though it softened slightly as his eyes moved over her, checking for any sign of harm. "Are you injured?" "No," Alira said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Only startled. Thank you for intervening." "They will be dealt with," he said, his jaw tight. "Behavior like that will not be tolerated in my castle, regardless of who the target might be." "I appreciate that," Alira said, then hesitated before adding, "though I wonder if you would have intervened so quickly for anyone else, or if my status as tribute made this particular incident more visible to you." Something flickered across his face again, that same unreadable expression she'd glimpsed in the courtyard weeks before. "Does it matter why I intervened, so long as the outcome protected you?" "I suppose not," Alira admitted, though the question lingered in her mind long after their conversation ended. "Still. Thank you, my king." He studied her for a long moment, and for the first time since her arrival, Alira thought she saw something in his eyes that wasn't distance or calculation. It looked almost like curiosity, almost like the beginning of genuine interest in the person standing before him, rather than the political obligation she represented. "Walk with me," he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise even himself. "I would like to hear more about why a girl who was given the smallest room in my castle continues to speak her mind so freely, despite every reason to remain silent." Alira's heart skipped, though she carefully kept her expression neutral. "As you wish, my king." They walked together through the quiet evening corridors, an unlikely pair, drawing curious glances from every servant and guard they passed. Alira had no idea what this conversation might mean, or where it might lead, but for the first time since arriving at this castle, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear about her uncertain future within its walls. Whatever Draven was beginning to see when he looked at her, She found herself wanting to know more about the man hiding behind those storm-gray eyes as well. Neither of them could have predicted, in that quiet evening moment, just how deeply their paths were about to become entangled, or how much both of their lives were about to change because of it. But change was coming, slow and certain as the turning seasons, and neither the smallest room in the castle nor the coldest heart within its walls would remain the same for very much longer. Alira returned to her small room that night, with her mind spinning from the conversation she'd shared with the king. They had walked for nearly an hour, speaking of small things at first, the weather, the state of the kitchen gardens, before the conversation gradually deepened into something more personal. Draven had asked about her home, her family, the pack she'd left behind. She had asked, carefully, about the empty seat at the head table during formal dinners, and watched his expression close like a door slamming shut. "That is not a topic for tonight," he had said, his voice suddenly distant again, and Alira had known better than to push further. Still, even that brief glimpse of vulnerability told her something important. Whatever haunted King Draven, whatever had turned him into the cold, guarded man everyone in the castle feared, it was tied to loss. Real loss, the kind that left permanent marks on a person's heart. She understood that kind of loss herself. She had watched her mother waste away from an illness no healer could cure, had watched her father's spirit break under the weight of a pack that could no longer sustain itself, had watched her younger sister cry herself to sleep every night after their family's fortune collapsed entirely. Loss was a language Alira spoke fluently, even if she had learned to hide her fluency behind a composed exterior. Perhaps that was why she found herself, against every reasonable instinct, drawn toward understanding the wounded king, rather than fearing him. As she settled into her narrow bed that night, listening to the familiar creak of the castle settling around her, Alira allowed herself a single dangerous thought before sleep finally claimed her. Perhaps the smallest room in the castle had not been given to her as punishment after all. Perhaps it had been given to her because it was the one place close enough to the servants' quarters, close enough to the shadows Draven himself preferred to occupy, that their paths were destined to cross again and again, whether either of them intended it or not. It was a foolish thought, she told herself, the kind of romantic nonsense that led young women into dangerous mistakes. And yet, as sleep finally pulled her under, she couldn't quite bring herself to let the thought go entirely. Something was beginning between them, something neither of them had chosen, and neither of them fully understood. And in a castle full of secrets, old grief, and dangers neither of them could yet see coming, that beginning would prove far more significant, and far more perilous, than either Alira or Draven could have possibly imagined on that quiet, star-filled night. The following weeks passed in a strange new rhythm neither of them acknowledged aloud. Draven began finding reasons to visit the kitchen gardens more frequently, always with some official pretext, a report to review, a matter to discuss with the head gardener, though his eyes would inevitably find Alira among the rows of vegetables and herbs. She began noticing small changes in how the castle staff treated her as well. Myrna started bringing slightly larger portions to her evening meals. The stable boy she'd defended began leaving small wildflowers outside her door, a silent thank you that always made her smile, despite the exhaustion of her long days. Even the guard who had shouted at the boy that day began offering her respectful nods when their paths crossed, though whether this stemmed from genuine remorse or simple fear of the king's displeasure, Alira couldn't say for certain. She told herself these small kindnesses meant nothing significant, that she was reading far too much into ordinary castle politics, and the natural human tendency to avoid a ruler's disfavor. But late at night, alone in her small room, with only the wind for company, she allowed herself to wonder if something larger was beginning to shift within these ancient stone walls. Something that had started, improbably, with the smallest room in the entire castle, and a king who had never expected to notice the woman he'd placed within it. The knife was at Alira's throat before she even understood what was happening. She had been walking back from the kitchen gardens at dusk, her arms full of freshly cut herbs, when a figure stepped from the shadows near the old well and grabbed her from behind. The blade pressed cold against her skin, and a rough voice hissed into her ear. "Scream, and I'll open your throat right here." Alira's heart slammed against her ribs, her herbs scattering across the stone path as her hands flew up instinctively. She forced herself to stay still, to think rather than panic, though every instinct screamed at her to fight. "What do you want?" she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're going to walk with me, quiet as you please, and if the king's guards ask, you'll tell them you wanted some air." The man's grip tightened on her arm. "Understand." Before Alira could respond, a low growl rumbled through the courtyard, and the man's grip suddenly vanished as he was ripped away from her with tremendous force. She stumbled forward, catching herself against the well's stone edge, and turned to find Draven standing over the attacker, his eyes blazing with a fury she had never witnessed before. "Who sent you?" Draven demanded, hauling the man up by his collar. The attacker, a stranger Alira didn't recognize, spat blood onto the stones but said nothing. Draven's guards arrived moments later, summoned by the commotion, and dragged the man away toward the castle dungeons, while Draven turned immediately to Alira, his hands hovering near her shoulders as though afraid to touch her and cause further harm. "Are you hurt?" His voice had lost all its usual coldness, replaced by something raw and urgent. "I'm fine," Alira said, though her hands were trembling badly as the shock began to settle in. "Just frightened." Draven's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say something more, something that went beyond simple concern for her safety. Instead, he simply nodded and gestured for her to follow him inside, away from the darkening courtyard and whatever danger still lurked within it. That night, Alira learned the truth she had been slowly piecing together for weeks. They sat together in a small private study, a fire crackling in the hearth while Draven poured 2 cups of warm spiced wine. His hands shook slightly as he handed her one, an unfamiliar vulnerability replacing his usual composed authority. "There is a rival pack," he began, staring into the flames, rather than meeting her eyes, "led by a man named Corwin, who has wanted my throne for many years. He believes that if he can destabilize my rule, create enough chaos and doubt among my people, he can claim leadership of the Northern Territories for himself." "And you believe tonight's attack was connected to him?" "I know it was." Draven's hands tightened around his cup. 3 years ago, he attempted something similar. He kidnapped someone close to me, someone I trusted completely, hoping to use her as leverage against me. Alira's breath caught. The empty seat at the dinner table. Draven's eyes finally lifted to meet hers, dark with old grief. "My sister, Kira. She was taken during a diplomatic visit to a neighboring pack, and by the time we found her, it was too late. Corwin's men had already—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, though Alira understood the horror he couldn't bring himself to voice. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I failed her," Draven said, his voice raw with a guilt he had clearly carried alone for far too long. "I was too focused on political matters, on maintaining my father's legacy, to notice the danger closing in around her, until it was too late to save her. I swore after that day I would never let anyone close enough to be used against me again." Understanding flooded through Alira like cold water. This explained everything, the ice in his eyes, the way he kept everyone at arm's length, the fear that lurked beneath his commanding presence. He wasn't cruel by nature. He was a man so consumed by grief and guilt that he had built walls around himself thick enough to keep the entire world at bay. "And yet you saved me tonight," Alira said softly. "You let me close enough to matter, even after everything you just told me." Draven's expression flickered with something like surprise, as though he hadn't fully considered the implications of his own actions until she pointed them out. "I don't know what is happening between us, Alira. I told myself when you arrived that you were simply a debt to be collected, nothing more. But you have made that impossible to believe." "Perhaps that isn't such a terrible thing," Alira offered carefully. "Perhaps not," Draven admitted, though his eyes carried a warning she couldn't ignore. "But if Corwin discovers how much I have come to care for your safety, he will see you as a weapon to use against me, just as he used my sister. I cannot allow that to happen again." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Alira understood the danger now, understood why tonight's attack had occurred, and understood the impossible position they now found themselves navigating together. Whatever connection had been growing between them over these past weeks was no longer simply a matter of 2 lonely hearts finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence. It had become something far more dangerous, a vulnerability that could be exploited, a weakness their enemies could use to bring down an entire kingdom. "What do we do?" she asked quietly. Draven was silent for a long moment, staring into the dying fire as though searching for answers within its embers. For now, we increase your protection. I will assign guards to watch over you at all times, and I will discover who within my own walls provided information to Corwin's man tonight, because someone here has betrayed us. The thought sent a fresh chill through Alira. A traitor within the castle meant that nowhere was truly safe, not even the small, unremarkable room she had been given upon her arrival. She thought suddenly of Myrna's kindness, of the stable boy's small wildflowers, of the many faces she had come to recognize and trust over these past weeks. Could any of them be working against Draven, against her, in service of his enemy? I don't know who to trust anymore, she admitted. Trust me, Draven said, his voice firm, despite the exhaustion evident in his eyes. I will not let what happened to Kira happen to you as well. Something in his tone, in the fierce protectiveness radiating from every word, made Alira's heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She studied his face in the firelight, the sharp angles softened slightly by shadow and flame, the storm-gray eyes that had seemed so cold upon her arrival, now burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. I trust you, she said simply, and watched something shift in his expression, something that looked remarkably like hope, breaking through years of carefully constructed ice. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the fire slowly dying down as the night deepened around them. Neither spoke of what had passed between them, of the confession Draven had shared, or the trust Alira had offered in return. Some moments, they both seemed to understand instinctively, needed time to settle before words could properly capture their significance. Eventually, Draven walked her back to her small room himself, insisting on personally checking the corridor and surrounding areas before allowing her to enter. He posted 2 guards outside her door, men she recognized as among his most trusted warriors, and lingered in the doorway a moment longer than necessary before finally saying goodnight. Sleep well, Alira, he said softly. You are safe now. Thank you, Draven. It was the first time she had used his name without the formal title attached, and she watched the small, almost imperceptible smile that touched his lips in response. Sleep well, he repeated, and then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence. Alira closed her door and leaned against it for a long moment, her heart still racing from the events of the evening, though the fear had gradually transformed into something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to hope, despite every reasonable warning bell ringing in the back of her mind. She thought of Corwin, the rival pack leader whose ambition had already claimed one life close to Draven's heart. She thought of the traitor somewhere within these castle walls, watching, waiting, ready to strike again the moment an opportunity presented itself. She thought of the dangerous, growing connection between herself and the wounded king, who had been given every reason to keep the world at bay, and yet had chosen, against his own better judgment, to let her in instead. The following days brought increased tension throughout the castle. Draven called an emergency council meeting, and Alira watched from a respectful distance as advisors and warriors filed into the great hall with grim expressions, clearly aware that the attack on her had significant political implications beyond a simple act of violence. She learned, through careful eavesdropping and Myrna's occasional whispered updates, that the attacker had refused to speak despite intense questioning, remaining loyal to Corwin even in the face of certain punishment. This loyalty troubled Draven's advisors deeply, suggesting that Corwin's influence had grown far more extensive than anyone had previously realized. There are whispers, Myrna confided one evening as she helped Alira mend a torn dress, that Corwin has been recruiting from among the smaller packs, promising wealth and territory to anyone willing to join his cause. Some fear he may be preparing for something larger than mere political maneuvering. War, Alira said quietly, the words settling like a stone in her stomach. Perhaps, Myrna agreed, her expression troubled. The king has doubled the guard along our borders, and there's talk of him reaching out to allied packs for additional support. Whatever is coming, dear, I fear it will not be resolved quietly or quickly. Alira absorbed this information with growing unease, understanding that whatever fragile connection was forming between herself and Draven now existed within a much larger, more dangerous context than she had initially realized. She was no longer simply navigating the complicated feelings developing between two people from vastly different worlds. She was potentially caught in the middle of a conflict that could reshape the entire northern territories, with real lives, real futures, hanging in the balance. That night, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion weighing on her body, Illyra found herself wandering toward the castle's small library, hoping that reading might distract her mind from the anxious thoughts circling endlessly through her head. She found Draven there instead, seated at a large wooden desk covered in maps and correspondence, his expression drawn with exhaustion and worry. "You should be resting," she said softly from the doorway. He looked up, and something in his face softened at the sight of her, despite the obvious weight of his responsibilities pressing down upon him. "I could say the same to you. I couldn't sleep," she admitted, stepping into the room. "Too many thoughts." "I understand that feeling well," Draven said, gesturing for her to join him. She crossed the room and settled into the chair across from his desk, studying the maps spread before him, marked with symbols she didn't fully understand, but that clearly indicated troop movements and territorial boundaries. "Is it truly as serious as Myrna suggested?" she asked carefully. Draven's expression grew grim. "Corwin has been quietly building an alliance for months, perhaps longer. Tonight's attack was not simply an attempt to harm you or use you against me. It was a test, a way to gauge my reactions and my defenses before he makes a larger move." "What kind of move?" "I don't know yet," Draven admitted, running a tired hand through his dark hair. "But I fear it will come soon, and I fear the cost, whatever form it takes, will be significant." Illyra reached across the desk, an instinctive gesture of comfort, and rested her hand gently over his. He went still at the contact, his eyes lifting to meet hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Whatever comes," she said softly, "you won't face it alone." For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging heavy in the quiet room between them. Then Draven turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that felt far more significant than either of them had intended when the evening began. "Illyra," he said, his voice rough with emotion he had clearly been suppressing for weeks, "I need you to understand something. What is happening between us, whatever this connection is that I cannot seem to control or deny any longer, it terrifies me more than any enemy I have ever faced on a battlefield." "Why?" she whispered, though she suspected she already understood the answer. "Because I have already lost someone I loved, to Corwin's ambition," Draven said, his eyes dark with old grief and new fear intertwined. "And I do not know if I could survive losing you as well." The confession hung between them, raw and honest, in a way that stole every rational thought from Illyra's mind. She had known, on some level, that her feelings toward this complicated, wounded man had grown into something far deeper than simple gratitude or curiosity. Hearing him voice similar feelings, admitting to a fear that clearly cost him greatly to acknowledge, made the reality of their situation impossible to ignore any longer. "You won't lose me," she said, though even as the words left her lips, she understood the impossibility of making such a promise, given the dangers gathering around them. Draven's expression suggested he understood this impossibility as well, though he seemed to draw comfort from her words regardless of their practical uncertainty. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. "I hope you are right," he murmured against her skin, "because I find myself caring for you far more than I ever intended to allow, and I do not think I possess the strength to simply let you go now, even if wisdom suggests I should." They remained together in that small library for hours, speaking quietly of fears and hopes neither had shared with another living soul, the danger surrounding them, somehow making the growing intimacy between them feel both more precious and more fragile than it might have otherwise. By the time Illyra finally returned to her small room, the sky outside had begun lightening toward dawn, and her heart carried a weight of feeling she had never expected to experience within these cold castle walls. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Corwin's ambition might bring crashing down upon them, Illyra understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that she had fallen deeply, irrevocably in love with the Alpha King who had once dismissed her as nothing more than a debt to be collected. And judging by the tenderness in his eyes as he'd bid her good night, she suspected the feeling was entirely mutual. Illyra woke to the sound of pounding on her door, urgent and frantic, and for one disoriented moment, she thought the castle itself was under attack. "Illyra," Please, open the door. It was Myrna's voice, thin with panic, in a way Alira had never heard from the steady older woman before. She scrambled out of bed and threw the door open to find Myrna standing in the corridor, her face pale, wringing her hands together anxiously. What's happened? Alira asked, fear already coiling tight in her stomach. The king, Myrna said, her voice trembling. There was a raid last night on the eastern border village. Corwin's men struck while our guards were spread thin. Several of our warriors were injured, and 2 of the villagers. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But Alira understood the implication all too well. Is Draven safe? He rode out himself the moment word arrived, Myrna said. He's been gone since before dawn. Alira's heart clenched painfully at the thought of Draven riding into potential danger, and she found herself dressing quickly despite having nowhere useful to go, driven by a restless need to do something, anything, rather than simply wait helplessly for news. The following hours passed in a haze of anxious uncertainty. Alira threw herself into whatever tasks she could find, helping Myrna organize supplies for the wounded, who would eventually be brought back to the castle, assisting the castle healer in preparing bandages and salves, anything to keep her hands busy while her mind raced with worry, for a man she had, against all reasonable caution, allowed herself to love. It was well past midday when the first riders returned, and Alira rushed toward the courtyard along with dozens of other anxious castle residents, her heart hammering as she scanned the group for any sign of Draven among them. Relief flooded through her when she spotted him near the front of the returning party, though her relief quickly transformed into alarm as she noticed the blood staining his left arm and the exhausted, grim set of his expression. "You're hurt," she said, rushing to his side the moment he dismounted. "It's minor," Draven assured her, though his voice carried a weariness that suggested the day's events had cost him far more than a simple physical wound. "Come. I need to speak with my advisors immediately, but I want you present as well." Alira followed him into the castle's council chamber, where his most trusted advisors and warriors gathered quickly, their expressions ranging from grim determination to barely concealed fear. Draven allowed the castle healer to briefly tend his wounded arm while he addressed the assembled group, his voice steady despite the obvious pain he must have been experiencing. "Corwin's forces struck the eastern village at dawn," Draven began, his eyes hard with barely restrained fury. 12 homes were burned. 2 villagers were killed, including a child. We managed to drive his men back before further damage could be done. But this was clearly a message, a demonstration of what Corwin is willing to do to achieve his ambitions. The room erupted into anxious discussion, advisors arguing over appropriate responses while warriors demanded immediate retaliation. Alira watched Draven's face throughout the heated debate, noting the careful control he maintained despite the obvious rage simmering beneath his composed exterior. "We cannot simply retaliate without careful planning," one advisor argued, an older man with graying hair and worried eyes. "Corwin clearly wants to provoke us into a hasty response that would leave our own borders vulnerable elsewhere. And we cannot simply allow innocent villagers to be slaughtered without response either," a young warrior countered heatedly. "Our people need to see that their king will protect them." Draven raised a hand, silencing the room with the gesture alone. "We will respond, but carefully. I want increased patrols along all our borders, not just the eastern territories where the attack occurred. I want messages sent to our allied packs, requesting additional support should this situation escalate further. And I want to know who within our own walls has been providing information to Corwin's forces, because someone here continues to betray us." The mention of a traitor sent a fresh wave of unease through the gathered council, and Alira noticed several advisors exchanging suspicious glances with one another, the atmosphere in the room growing tense with mutual distrust. It was a troubling reminder of how deeply Corwin's influence had already penetrated their supposedly secure walls, and how difficult it might be to identify the source of the ongoing betrayal. The council meeting continued for hours, plans and counterplans discussed and debated until exhaustion finally forced an end to the proceedings. Alira remained by Draven's side throughout, offering quiet support even as she absorbed the grim reality of the conflict unfolding around them. Later that evening, after the advisors had finally dispersed, and the castle had settled into a tense, watchful quiet, Alira found Draven alone in his private chambers, staring out a window that overlooked the darkened countryside beyond the castle walls. "You should rest," she said softly, approaching him carefully. You've had a difficult day. I keep thinking about that child, Draven said, his voice heavy with grief and guilt he clearly felt responsible for, despite having no direct hand in the tragedy. 7 years old, Corwin's men didn't even hesitate. This isn't your fault, Alira said firmly, moving to stand beside him at the window. Isn't it? Draven turned to face her, his eyes dark with old pain resurfacing alongside new grief. I am the Alpha King. Protecting my people is my most fundamental responsibility, and I failed that child, just as I failed my sister 3 years ago. You didn't fail anyone, Alira insisted, reaching up to gently touch his face, forcing him to meet her eyes directly. Corwin is responsible for these atrocities, not you. You cannot predict every move he makes, cannot prevent every act of violence he chooses to commit. You can only continue fighting to protect as many people as possible, and that is exactly what you are doing. Draven's expression softened slightly beneath her touch, though the guilt remained evident in his eyes. I don't know how you continue to see good in me, Alira, when I have watched you witness firsthand how much darkness and danger surrounds my rule. Because the good is there, she said simply. I see it every time you protect someone weaker than yourself, every time you choose careful strategy over hasty vengeance, even when your anger clearly demands otherwise. Every time you allow yourself to feel grief for lives lost, rather than simply hardening yourself against the pain entirely. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, as though searching for something he desperately needed to find. You make me want to believe I might still become the kind of king my people deserve, despite everything Corwin has already taken from me. You already are that king, Alira said softly. You simply need to believe it yourself. Draven leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she chose, but Alira remained still, her heart racing, as his lips finally met hers in a gentle, searching kiss that seemed to carry within it every unspoken fear and hope they had shared over the preceding weeks. The kiss deepened gradually, tender and unhurried, despite the danger and uncertainty surrounding them, and Alira found herself surrendering completely to the moment, to the man she had come to love, despite every reasonable warning against such feelings. When they finally broke apart, Draven rested his forehead against hers, his breathing slightly unsteady. I meant what I said before, Alira. I am terrified of how much I have come to care for you, especially now that Corwin has proven himself capable of such violence. I know, Alira whispered. I'm frightened too, but I don't regret allowing myself to feel this way about you, regardless of the danger it might bring. Nor do I, Draven admitted. Though I fear the cost, we might eventually pay for this connection between us. His words proved prophetic, sooner than either of them anticipated. 3 days later, Draven called Alira into his private study, his expression grave, in a way that immediately set her nerves on edge. Waiting alongside him was an unfamiliar advisor, an older woman, with sharp eyes, and a stern bearing that suggested significant political influence within the castle hierarchy. Alira, this is Lady Vesna, Draven introduced formally. She serves as one of my most trusted diplomatic advisors, particularly regarding relations with our allied pacts. Lady Vesna studied Alira with an assessing gaze that made her feel distinctly uncomfortable, as though being evaluated for some purpose she didn't yet understand. I have heard a great deal about you, young woman. It seems your presence here has generated significant discussion throughout the castle and beyond. I'm not certain I understand, Alira said carefully. Corwin's recent aggression has forced our hand regarding certain diplomatic matters, Draven explained, his jaw tight with obvious reluctance to continue. Several of our allied pacts have expressed concerns about the political situation here, concerns that have unfortunately become entangled with your presence in my castle. What kind of concerns? Alira asked, dread beginning to pool in her stomach. Lady Vesna answered, before Draven could continue. There are rumors, likely originating from Corwin's own spies, suggesting that the king's growing attachment to a tribute payment from a minor pack indicates weakness in his leadership. Some of our allies fear this apparent vulnerability makes an already precarious situation even more dangerous. They believe my presence here threatens the stability of Draven's alliances, Alira said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn with painful clarity. Precisely, Lady Vesna confirmed. Several allied pack leaders have suggested, quite strongly, that removing this particular source of political vulnerability would help stabilize the current crisis and demonstrate the king's continued strength and focus. Illyra felt the color drain from her face as the full implication of the conversation settled over her. She turned to Draven, searching his expression for reassurance, but found instead a complicated mixture of anger and helplessness that told her everything she needed to know about the impossible position he now found himself navigating. "You're saying I should leave," she said quietly. "I am saying," Lady Vesna corrected carefully, "that the current political situation makes your continued presence here considerably more complicated than it once was. The decision, of course, ultimately rests with the king." All eyes turned toward Draven, who remained silent for a long, agonizing moment before finally speaking. "I will not simply cast Illyra aside, because political pressures demand it," he said firmly, though the strain in his voice suggested the depth of the conflict raging within him. "However, I also cannot ignore the very real danger this situation presents, both to our alliance network and potentially to Illyra herself, given how visibly Corwin has already targeted her." "Then what do you propose?" Lady Vesna asked. "I need time to consider our options," Draven said. "This decision cannot be made hastily, particularly given the personal significance involved." Lady Vesna's expression remained carefully neutral, though Illyra suspected the older woman understood far more about the true nature of their relationship than either of them had explicitly stated. "Very well, my king, but I would caution against delaying too long. Our allies grow increasingly nervous with each passing day, and Corwin will certainly attempt to exploit any perceived weakness within our alliance structure." After Lady Vesna departed, Illyra and Draven remained alone in the tense silence of his study, the weight of the impossible situation pressing heavily between them. "I won't send you away," Draven said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Regardless of what political pressures suggest, I cannot simply abandon you to protect my alliances. But if my presence here truly endangers everything you're fighting to protect," Illyra said slowly, forcing herself to consider the situation rationally despite the ache building in her chest, "perhaps leaving would be the wisest choice, regardless of what either of us wants personally." "Don't say that," Draven said sharply, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "I refuse to lose you the way I lost Kira. I refuse to let Corwin's manipulation dictate the choices I make regarding my own heart. Even if that choice potentially endangers everything else you're responsible for protecting?" Illyra asked softly. Draven's expression tightened with obvious internal conflict, and he didn't immediately answer her question, the silence stretching uncomfortably between them, as they both grappled with an impossible situation that seemed to offer no satisfactory resolution. "Give me time," he finally said. "Time to find a solution that doesn't require sacrificing either your safety or our alliance network. There must be a way to navigate this crisis without losing you in the process." Illyra wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to trust that some solution existed that would allow their relationship to continue without endangering everything Draven had worked so hard to build and protect. But as she left his study that evening, her heart heavy with uncertainty, she couldn't shake the growing fear that circumstances beyond either of their control were rapidly narrowing toward a choice neither of them wanted to make. Over the following days, the political pressure surrounding Illyra's presence in the castle continued mounting steadily. She noticed subtle changes in how certain advisors treated her, a coolness replacing what had previously been cautious respect. Whispered conversations would fall silent when she entered rooms, and she caught more than one worried glance exchanged between courtiers, who clearly understood the precarious position she now occupied within the castle's complex political landscape. Draven remained steadfast in his refusal to send her away, but Illyra could see the toll this ongoing conflict was taking on him, the exhaustion deepening beneath his eyes, the tension permanently etched into his shoulders as he balanced his growing feelings for her against the very real political dangers threatening his kingdom's stability. One evening, nearly a week after Lady Vesna's initial visit, Illyra found herself walking through the castle gardens, seeking a few moments of peace, away from the constant tension permeating every corner of castle life. She was surprised to find Myrna waiting for her near a small stone bench, the older woman's expression uncharacteristically serious. "I overheard something today that I think you need to know," Myrna said without preamble, glancing around carefully to ensure their privacy. "Lady Vesna met with several council members this afternoon, discussing contingency plans should the king refuse to address the political concerns surrounding your presence." "What kind of contingency plans?" Illyra asked, dread coiling tight in her stomach. Myrna hesitated, clearly reluctant to share whatever information she had gathered, but eventually continued. They discussed the possibility of arranging your removal from the castle, without the king's direct involvement, framing it as protecting his interests, despite his personal objections. Some believe that if presented with your absence as an already accomplished fact, the political crisis could be resolved more quickly than waiting for the king to reach his own difficult decision. Horror flooded through Illyra as she absorbed this information. They're planning to have me removed against Draven's wishes? I don't know how serious these discussions truly are, Myrna admitted, or whether they possess the authority to actually act against the king's stated wishes. But I felt you needed to know the extent of the pressure building against you, dear. This situation is far more dangerous than perhaps even the king himself fully realizes. Illyra sat in stunned silence for a long moment, processing the frightening implications of what she'd just learned. If Draven's own advisors were willing to act against his explicit wishes to resolve the political crisis surrounding her presence, then remaining in the castle might endanger not only her own safety, but potentially create a genuine crisis of authority within Draven's own court. Thank you for telling me, she finally said, though her voice carried a heaviness that hadn't been there before. I need to think carefully about what this means. As Myrna departed, leaving Illyra alone once more in the quiet garden, she found herself confronting a painful truth she had been avoiding since Lady Vesna's initial visit. Her presence in this castle, regardless of the genuine love that had grown between herself and Draven, was creating dangers that extended far beyond simple political inconvenience. If his own advisors were willing to circumvent his authority to resolve this crisis, the stability of his entire rule might be at risk. She loved Draven deeply, more deeply than she had ever imagined loving another person. But that love, she realized with growing certainty, might require sacrifices neither of them wanted to make, choices that would test the very foundation of everything they had built together over these past weeks. As she sat alone beneath the darkening sky, watching the first stars emerge above the castle walls, Illyra began to understand that the greatest challenge facing their relationship might not come from Corwin's external threats after all. It might come from the impossible choice she would soon need to make between her own happiness and the stability of everything Draven had sworn to protect. A messenger arrived at dawn, breathless and covered in road dust, demanding immediate audience with the king. Illyra watched from the corridor as the young man was rushed into Draven's private study, his urgent tone carrying clearly enough for her to catch fragments of the report he delivered. Corwin, gathering forces, moving toward the northern pass. She felt her stomach drop with each fragment she overheard, understanding that whatever fragile peace had existed between the two rival leaders was rapidly collapsing into something far more dangerous. Draven emerged from his study nearly an hour later, his expression grim and exhausted, in a way that told Illyra the news had been worse than she'd feared. He found her waiting in the corridor, having refused to leave despite Myrna's gentle suggestions that she return to her room. Corwin has assembled a significant force, he said without preamble, clearly too troubled to bother with formalities. He's moving toward the northern pass with what my scouts estimate to be nearly 300 warriors. That's an army, Illyra said, horror creeping into her voice. Yes, Draven confirmed grimly. This is no longer simply a series of provocative raids designed to test my defenses. This is preparation for genuine war. The following days brought a flurry of frantic activity throughout the castle. Draven spent nearly every waking hour in council meetings, coordinating with his warriors and advisors to prepare adequate defenses against the looming threat. Illyra found herself increasingly relegated to the sidelines during this critical period, understanding intellectually that Draven's full attention needed to remain focused on protecting his kingdom, even as her heart ached at the growing distance between them. She threw herself into whatever practical assistance she could offer, helping organize medical supplies, assisting with the evacuation planning for vulnerable villages near the northern border, doing anything within her limited power to contribute meaningfully to the mounting crisis. But she couldn't shake the persistent worry that continued gnawing at her, the fear that her presence in the castle, regardless of how much she wished to help, remained a political liability, during a moment when Draven desperately needed the full support of his allied packs. One evening, nearly a week after the messenger's alarming report, Illyra found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with worry, for Draven, and the mounting danger threatening his kingdom. She made her way toward his study, hoping perhaps to offer some small comfort during what she knew must be an incredibly stressful period, only to overhear voices through the partially open door that stopped her cold in the corridor. The Allied packs are growing increasingly nervous, Lady Vesna's voice carried clearly into the hallway. Pack Ravensguard has already indicated they may withdraw their support entirely if the situation surrounding the tribute girl isn't resolved soon. They fear your judgment has been compromised by personal feelings during a moment when clear strategic thinking is absolutely essential. My judgment remains entirely clear, Draven's voice replied, tight with barely controlled frustration. I have not allowed personal feelings to influence any strategic decisions regarding our defense against Corwin. Perhaps not yet, Lady Vesna continued, her tone carrying genuine concern rather than mere political calculation. But my king, you must understand how this appears to our allies. War is coming, possibly the largest conflict our territories have faced in generations, and you are risking crucial alliance support over your attachment to a single woman from a minor pack. I understand your feelings for her are genuine, but the stakes have grown too significant to allow personal matters to jeopardize our broader defensive capabilities. Elira's heart clenched painfully as she listened, understanding with sickening clarity the impossible position her presence continued creating for Draven during this critical moment. She had known, on some level, that the political pressure surrounding their relationship remained a serious concern, but hearing it discussed so explicitly, hearing the very real threat of Allied packs withdrawing support during a moment of genuine military crisis, made the true severity of the situation impossible to ignore any longer. What would you have me do? Draven's voice carried a weariness that broke Elira's heart even as she remained frozen in the corridor, unable to make herself walk away from a conversation that clearly concerned her own fate. Abandon her simply because our allies demand it? I would have you consider the thousands of lives that depend on maintaining strong alliances during this crisis, Lady Vesna said quietly. I do not envy the choice before you, my king, but you must weigh your personal happiness against the safety and stability of everyone under your protection. Silence followed this statement, stretching long enough that Elira eventually forced herself to retreat from the corridor, unable to bear listening any longer to a conversation that felt increasingly like the beginning of an ending she desperately didn't want to face. She returned to her small room, sleep entirely impossible now, and sat alone in the darkness, turning over the impossible choice that seemed to be rapidly closing in around both herself and Draven. The following morning, Draven sought her out, finding her in the kitchen gardens where she had retreated to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of physical labor. His expression carried a heaviness she recognized immediately, and her stomach tightened with dread even before he spoke. We need to talk, he said quietly. Elira set down her gardening tools and followed him to a secluded corner of the garden, away from potential eavesdroppers, her heart already breaking in anticipation of whatever difficult conversation awaited them. I overheard your conversation with Lady Vesna last night, she admitted, before he could begin. I know how serious the political pressure has become. Draven's expression flickered with surprise, then resignation. Then you understand the impossible situation we now find ourselves navigating. I do, Elira said, forcing herself to remain composed despite the ache building in her chest. And I understand, perhaps better than you might expect, exactly what needs to happen for you to protect your kingdom during this crisis. Elira, please don't. Let me finish, she said gently, reaching out to take his hand, despite the pain evident in his eyes. I love you, Draven. I have come to love you more deeply than I ever imagined possible, given how our relationship began. But I also understand that thousands of innocent lives depend on you making difficult decisions during this critical moment, decisions that cannot be compromised by personal feelings, regardless of how genuine those feelings might be. I refuse to simply cast you aside, Draven said fiercely, gripping her hand tightly. I told you before, I will not lose you the way I lost Kira. I'm not asking you to cast me aside, Elira said softly, though even as she spoke the words, uncertainty crept into her heart about what exactly she was asking, or what solution might actually resolve this seemingly impossible situation. I'm simply acknowledging the reality we're facing together. Perhaps there's a way forward that doesn't require either abandoning our feelings for each other, or endangering everything you're responsible for protecting. What kind of way forward? Draven asked, hope flickering uncertainly in his storm-gray eyes. Elira considered the question carefully, her mind racing through various possibilities, even as she recognized the limitations each option presented. Perhaps if I stepped back publicly, at least temporarily, allowed the political tension to settle, while Corwin's threat remains the primary focus of everyone's attention, it might buy enough time for the crisis to resolve, without permanently sacrificing what exists between us. You're suggesting we hide our relationship, Draven said slowly. I'm suggesting we prioritize survival first, Alira clarified. For you, for your kingdom, for everyone depending on your leadership during this dangerous time. Whatever exists between us can wait until the immediate crisis passes, can't it? Draven was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the practical wisdom of her suggestion, against his own reluctance to distance himself from her, even temporarily. I don't like this solution, he finally admitted, but I recognize the wisdom in it, particularly given how quickly the situation with Corwin continues escalating. Then we're agreed, Alira said, though her heart ached with the compromise even as she recognized its necessity. For now, we focus entirely on defending against Corwin's threat. Whatever exists between us remains private, at least until this immediate danger passes. They stood together in the quiet garden for a long moment, neither quite ready to release the other's hand, despite having just agreed to create distance between them for the sake of political necessity. Finally, Draven pulled her into a tight embrace, pressing a lingering kiss to her forehead before finally stepping back. This isn't goodbye, he said firmly, as much for his own reassurance as for hers. This is simply patience. Necessary patience, given everything at stake. I understand, Alira said softly, though the ache in her chest suggested her heart understood something more complicated and painful about the promise they were making to each other. Over the following weeks, Alira watched as Draven threw himself entirely into preparing his kingdom's defenses, his public demeanor returning to the cold, distant authority she remembered from her earliest days in the castle. They maintained careful distance from each other in public settings, exchanging only brief, formal acknowledgements when their paths crossed during official castle business. Only in rare, carefully arranged private moments did they allow themselves to reconnect, stolen minutes, in quiet corners of the castle, where the weight of their necessary public performance could finally be set aside. These stolen moments, however brief, remained precious anchors during an increasingly stressful period. Draven would find her in the kitchen gardens after dark, sharing quiet updates about the mounting military preparations, or she would slip into his study late at night when the rest of the castle had finally settled into uneasy sleep, offering whatever emotional support she could provide during his obviously mounting stress. But even these careful precautions couldn't entirely eliminate the political tension surrounding Alira's continued presence in the castle. Lady Vesna's warnings about allied pact concerns continued proving prophetic, as reports arrived indicating that at least two of Draven's traditional allies remained hesitant to commit their full military support, citing concerns about the king's judgment and focus during this critical moment. The pressure eventually reached a breaking point, nearly a month after Corwin's forces had first been spotted gathering near the northern pass. Draven called Alira into his study late one evening, his expression carrying a gravity that immediately set her nerves on edge. Pack Thornwood has agreed to commit their full military support, he began without preamble, but only under specific conditions. What conditions? Alira asked, dread already coiling in her stomach. They require assurance that no personal attachments will compromise my strategic decision-making during the upcoming conflict, Draven said, his voice tight, with obvious reluctance to continue. Specifically, they've requested that you be relocated to a secure location, away from the castle entirely, at least until the immediate military crisis has been fully resolved. Alira felt the color drain from her face as she absorbed this latest development. They want me sent away. I refused their initial request, Draven said quickly, but without Thornwood's military support, our defensive capabilities against Corwin's forces would be severely compromised. We're already facing significant numerical disadvantages, and losing another allied pact's commitment could prove catastrophic for everyone under my protection. So you need to send me away, Alira said quietly, understanding the impossible mathematics of the situation, even as her heart broke at the prospect. I don't want to, Draven said fiercely, crossing the room to take her hands in his. But Alira, we're potentially talking about the difference between successfully defending our territories and suffering devastating losses that could claim thousands of innocent lives, I cannot in good conscience prioritize my personal happiness over such catastrophic stakes. Illyra closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe through the pain building in her chest, understanding with painful clarity that whatever solution they eventually reached would require sacrifices neither of them wanted to make. Where would I go? There's a secure village, nearly 2 days' journey from here, Draven explained carefully. It's far enough from the primary conflict zone to remain safe, but close enough that I could arrange regular updates about your well-being. It wouldn't be permanent, Illyra, simply until the immediate crisis with Corwin has been resolved. And if the crisis takes months to resolve? Or longer? Illyra asked, voicing the fear that had been building steadily throughout their entire relationship. Draven's expression tightened with obvious pain at the question, unable to offer the reassurance they both desperately wanted. I don't know, he admitted honestly. But I know that keeping you here, watching Thornwood potentially withdraw their crucial support, risking catastrophic losses that could have been prevented, that isn't a choice I can make in good conscience, regardless of how much I love you. The words hung between them, heavy with an honesty that felt simultaneously devastating and necessary. Illyra understood, on some fundamental level, that Draven was correct. The stakes facing his kingdom extended far beyond their personal happiness, involved thousands of lives that depended on strong alliances and clear strategic leadership during an increasingly dangerous conflict. When would I need to leave? She asked softly. Within the next few days, Draven said, his voice carrying obvious reluctance, despite recognizing the necessity of the decision. I'll arrange for trusted guards to escort you safely to the village, and I'll ensure you have everything you need to remain comfortable during your time there. Illyra nodded slowly, though every instinct rebelled against the prospect of leaving Draven's side during such a dangerous and uncertain time. I understand the necessity, even if I hate it. As do I, Draven said, pulling her into a tight embrace that felt heavy with unspoken fears about what the future might hold for their relationship. This isn't the end of what exists between us, Illyra. I promise you that. The moment this crisis with Corwin is resolved, I will bring you back to the castle myself, regardless of what political pressures might attempt to prevent it. Illyra wanted desperately to believe his promise, wanted to trust that their love would survive whatever separation and danger the coming weeks might bring. But as she held onto him tightly in the quiet privacy of his study, she couldn't quite shake the growing fear that this necessary compromise might mark the beginning of a much longer, more painful separation than either of them currently anticipated. Outside, the night sky remained clear and star-filled, offering no hints about the storm of conflict and danger steadily approaching from the northern territories. But within the walls of Draven's study, Illyra understood with growing certainty that whatever peaceful chapter of their relationship had existed over these past weeks was rapidly drawing to a close, replaced by uncertainty, danger, and a separation neither of them truly wanted, but both recognized as necessary, given the impossible circumstances surrounding them. The village of Hollow Creek sat nestled between two low hills, quiet and unassuming, in a way that felt worlds away from the tension gripping Draven's castle. Illyra arrived after 2 days of travel, escorted by 4 guards, who treated her with careful, respectful distance throughout the journey, clearly under strict orders, to ensure her safety, without revealing any details of her true significance to the king. The small cottage arranged for her stay belonged to a widow named Petra, a warm, talkative woman who welcomed Illyra without asking too many questions about her circumstances or the reasons behind her sudden arrival. Illyra suspected Draven had paid generously for both Petra's hospitality and her discretion, though she never confirmed this suspicion aloud. The first few days passed in a strange, disorienting quiet. After weeks of constant tension and political maneuvering within the castle, the peaceful rhythm of village life felt almost surreal. Illyra helped Petra with household tasks, walked the quiet forest paths surrounding the village, and tried desperately not to think about the mounting danger Draven faced as Corwin's forces continued gathering near the northern pass. News arrived infrequently, carried by the occasional messenger Draven managed to send, despite his obviously overwhelming responsibilities. Each letter brought a mixture of relief and fresh anxiety. Relief that he remained safe, anxiety about the deteriorating military situation he described in careful, measured language, clearly designed to avoid alarming her unnecessarily. 2 weeks into her stay, a letter arrived that shattered the fragile peace Alira had managed to construct for herself in Hollow Creek. Corwin's forces attacked the northern border in full strength 3 days ago, Draven wrote, his usually careful handwriting slightly unsteady, in places that suggested the letter had been written during moments of significant stress or exhaustion. We suffered losses, though nowhere near as catastrophic as they might have been without Thornwood's support. I think of you constantly, Alira, and I count the days until I can bring you home safely. Alira read the letter multiple times, searching for reassurance within the careful words, though the underlying tension and danger remained clearly evident, despite Draven's obvious attempts to minimize his own worry. She wrote back immediately, offering whatever comfort and support she could provide through simple written words, though the distance between them felt like an physical ache she couldn't quite escape. As weeks stretched into a full month, Alira gradually settled into the rhythm of village life, though she never stopped watching the road for messengers, never stopped listening for news about the ongoing conflict that had separated her from the man she loved. Petra proved a steady, comforting presence during this uncertain period, sharing stories of her own life and offering practical wisdom about patience and resilience that Alira found herself increasingly grateful for. Whoever he is, Petra said one evening as they shared a simple meal together, he must be someone truly special, given how carefully your absence from wherever you came from has been arranged. Alira smiled sadly, unable to share the true details of her circumstances, but appreciating Petra's gentle acknowledgement of her obvious heartache. He is special, though our circumstances have made things considerably more complicated than either of us anticipated. Complications have a way of resolving themselves, dear, Petra offered kindly. Sometimes it simply takes more time and patience than we would prefer. Alira held on to those words during the difficult weeks that followed, though her patience was tested repeatedly, as news from the castle grew increasingly concerning. Draven's letters, while never explicitly detailing the full extent of the military crisis, carried an undertone of growing exhaustion and strain that worried her deeply. She learned, through careful reading between the lines, that the conflict with Corwin had evolved into something more prolonged and costly than anyone had initially anticipated. Nearly 2 months after her arrival in Hollow Creek, Alira received a letter that filled her with fresh dread. Corwin has proposed a temporary truce, Draven wrote, though I suspect this offer stems more from tactical necessity than genuine desire for peace. His forces have suffered significant losses as well, and I believe he seeks time to regroup and strengthen his position before resuming hostilities. I have agreed to preliminary negotiations, though I remain deeply skeptical of his true intentions. The letter continued, describing the complicated diplomatic maneuvering now required alongside the ongoing military tension, and Alira found herself growing increasingly anxious about how this new development might affect Draven's already precarious political position regarding their relationship. Her fears proved well-founded when Draven's next letter arrived nearly 3 weeks later, its contents leaving her heart heavy with disappointment and renewed uncertainty. The negotiations with Corwin have created additional complications, he wrote, his careful language failing to entirely disguise the underlying tension. Several allied pacts believe that demonstrating complete focus and stability during this delicate diplomatic period remains essential, particularly given Corwin's apparent willingness to exploit any perceived weakness. I fear this means your return to the castle must be delayed further than either of us originally hoped. Alira set the letter down with trembling hands, disappointment and frustration warring within her chest, despite her intellectual understanding of the political necessities Draven continued navigating. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the temporary truce might allow their separation to finally end, might allow her to return to the castle and the man she loved. Instead, the complicated political landscape continued demanding further sacrifice, further patience she wasn't certain she still possessed. She wrote back that evening, her response carrying more honest frustration than she had allowed herself to express in previous letters. I understand the political necessities you continue navigating, she wrote carefully, though her hand shook slightly as she formed the words, but I confess growing weary of promises about eventual return that continue being postponed indefinitely. I love you, Draven, and I trust your judgment regarding these impossible circumstances, but I need you to understand how difficult this continued separation has become, both for my own heart and for my growing uncertainty about whether we will ever truly find our way back to each other. She sent the letter the following morning, immediately regretting the honesty of her words, even as she recognized their necessity. The weeks that followed brought no response, and Alira's anxiety grew steadily with each passing day of continued silence. Nearly a month after sending her frustrated letter, with still no response from Draven, Alira began seriously questioning whether their relationship could survive the mounting political pressures continuing to keep them apart. She confided her growing doubts to Petra one evening, unable to contain the emotional weight she had been carrying largely alone during her extended stay in Hollow Creek. "Perhaps," Petra said gently, though her expression carried obvious sympathy for Alira's obvious distress, "the silence doesn't necessarily indicate what you fear it might. Important men facing significant political crises don't always have the luxury of immediate correspondence, regardless of how much they might wish otherwise. I know that intellectually," Alira admitted, "but my heart continues fearing the worst regardless." That night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Alira found herself walking the quiet village paths under a canopy of stars, her mind racing through countless possible explanations for Draven's continued silence. Perhaps the diplomatic negotiations with Corwin had grown even more complicated, requiring his complete attention in ways that left no time for personal correspondence. Perhaps her honest letter had somehow damaged something essential between them, revealing insecurities and frustrations that Draven found difficult to address given his overwhelming responsibilities. Or perhaps, her most frightening fear, something had happened to him during the ongoing conflict that no one had yet informed her about, given her distant location away from the castle's immediate information networks. She was still walking, lost in anxious thought, when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention toward the village's main road. Her heart leapt with sudden hope, though she immediately cautioned herself against unrealistic expectations, understanding that messengers arrived regularly, regardless of any personal significance to their timing. But as the riders drew closer, illuminated by the pale moonlight, Alira's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the familiar figure leading the small group. Draven. He dismounted quickly, his exhaustion evident even in the poor lighting, and crossed the distance between them with long, purposeful strides that suggested he had been thinking of nothing else during his entire journey. Alira found herself running toward him despite every reasonable instinct suggesting she should maintain some measure of composed dignity, and he caught her easily as she reached him, pulling her into a tight embrace that spoke volumes about the weeks of separation and uncertainty they had both endured. "You're here," she said, her voice muffled against his chest, tears she hadn't realized she was holding back, finally spilling free. "I couldn't stay away any longer," Draven admitted, his own voice rough with emotion as he held her tightly. "Your letter, Alira. It broke something in me. I realized I had been so focused on protecting my kingdom that I nearly lost sight of protecting what matters most within it." He pulled back slightly, cupping her face gently in his hands as he studied her features with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm sorry for the extended silence. Negotiations with Corwin grew far more complicated than anticipated, and I found myself trapped in endless diplomatic sessions that left little time for anything beyond immediate crisis management. But that's no excuse for leaving you without word for so long, especially after everything you expressed in your letter." "What happened with the negotiations?" Alira asked, though her primary focus remained on simply absorbing the reality of his presence after weeks of anxious separation. "We reached a formal truce," Draven explained, though his expression suggested the resolution carried complicated implications. "Corwin has agreed to withdraw his forces from our contested borders, at least temporarily, in exchange for certain territorial concessions and trade agreements. It's not the outcome I would have preferred, but it provides breathing room to strengthen our defenses before any future conflict potentially resumes." "And our situation?" Alira asked carefully. "The political pressure regarding my presence?" Draven's expression grew more serious, though something like fierce determination replaced the earlier uncertainty in his eyes. "Regardless of what political pressures continue existing, I refuse to allow this situation to persist any longer. I love you, and I've spent these past months living with the constant fear that my hesitation and caution might ultimately cost me the most important relationship I've ever known." "What are you saying?" Alira asked, hope and uncertainty mingling in her chest. "I'm saying I want you to return with me to the castle, permanently this time," Draven said firmly. "I'm saying I'm prepared to address whatever political concerns remain directly and completely, rather than continuing to allow those concerns to dictate the terms of our relationship. I love you, Alira, and I refuse to spend another day hiding that truth from anyone who might object. Alira felt tears building again, though these carried none of the earlier heartache, replaced instead by overwhelming relief and joy at finally hearing Draven speak with such clear, unwavering conviction about their future together. Are you certain? After everything that's happened, all the political complications that nearly tore us apart? I have never been more certain of anything, Draven said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. I spent these past months fighting to protect my kingdom from external threats, but I nearly lost something equally precious by allowing internal political pressures to dictate my personal happiness. I won't make that mistake again. He kissed her then, deep and searching, carrying within it every fear and hope and unwavering love that had somehow survived months of dangerous separation and political uncertainty. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Alira found herself smiling, despite the emotional exhaustion of the preceding weeks. Then let's go home, she said softly. They departed Hollow Creek early the following morning, Petra bidding them farewell with knowing eyes, and a warm embrace for Alira that suggested the older woman had understood far more about her circumstances than she had ever explicitly stated. The journey back to Draven's castle felt entirely different from her initial departure months earlier, filled now with cautious optimism rather than uncertain fear about what the future might hold. As they approached the familiar castle walls, Alira felt her heart swell with a complicated mixture of relief, joy, and lingering anxiety about how their return might be received, given the political complications that had necessitated her departure in the first place. But Draven rode beside her with unwavering confidence, his hand occasionally finding hers during quiet moments of their journey, offering silent reassurance that whatever challenges remained ahead, they would face them together, rather than allowing external pressures to separate them once again. The castle gates opened to receive them, and as Alira crossed the familiar threshold for the first time in months, she couldn't help but notice the curious, whispered reactions from various castle staff and courtiers who witnessed her unexpected return. Whatever political storms still awaited them within these ancient walls, she understood with growing certainty that she and Draven would navigate them together, their love having survived the ultimate test of extended separation and impossible political pressure. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners rather than allowing fear or political calculation to dictate the terms of their happiness ever again. Little did either of them realize, as they rode through those castle gates with hearts full of renewed hope and determination, just how quickly their fragile peace would once again be threatened by dangers neither of them could fully anticipate. The peace lasted exactly 11 days. Alira had settled back into castle life with a happiness she hadn't dared imagine possible after months of anxious separation. Draven had, true to his word, addressed the political concerns surrounding their relationship directly, calling a formal council meeting where he announced his intentions regarding Alira clearly and without apology. Several advisors had expressed continued reservations, but none dared openly challenge the king's explicit declaration, and gradually the castle atmosphere began shifting toward cautious acceptance of the relationship everyone had suspected, but no one had previously acknowledged directly. Myrna had wept with joy upon Alira's return, embracing her tightly and expressing relief that the months of anxious uncertainty had finally resolved in their favor. The stable boy, now noticeably taller after the months of her absence, had left an entire bouquet of wildflowers outside her new room, a much larger space near the castle's private quarters that Draven had insisted upon immediately following her return. But on the 12th day, everything changed. Alira was returning from an evening walk through the gardens when she overheard voices carrying from a partially concealed alcove near the castle's western entrance. She recognized Lady Vesna's voice immediately, along with an unfamiliar male voice carrying a tone of urgent, barely suppressed anger. "The truce with Corwin remains far more fragile than the king seems to understand," the unfamiliar voice was saying. "His spies have already reported that Corwin views the girl's return as evidence of exactly the weakness he's been hoping to exploit. He's using it to convince the remaining neutral pacts that our king prioritizes personal desires over strategic wisdom. I've warned him repeatedly about these exact concerns," Lady Vesna replied, her voice carrying genuine worry rather than simple political calculation. "But he refuses to listen, insisting that his personal happiness cannot be sacrificed to political pressure any longer." Then perhaps the decision needs to be taken from his hands entirely, the male voice suggested darkly. If Corwin believes he can exploit this vulnerability to fracture our remaining alliances, the consequences could prove catastrophic. Thousands of lives depend on maintaining unified strength during this critical period, and one woman's presence continues threatening that unity. Elira's blood ran cold as she absorbed the implications of this conversation, understanding that the political dangers surrounding her presence hadn't actually resolved, despite Draven's public declaration weeks earlier. If anything, her return had apparently provided Corwin with fresh ammunition to further destabilize the fragile alliance network protecting Draven's kingdom from renewed conflict. She retreated quietly from the alcove, her mind racing with fresh anxiety about what this overheard conversation might mean for their future together. Should she tell Draven what she'd heard? Would doing so simply create additional stress during an already precarious diplomatic period? Or would keeping silent about such a serious threat constitute a betrayal of the trust they had worked so hard to rebuild? She decided, ultimately, that honesty remained essential to whatever future they hoped to build together, and sought Draven out that evening in his private study. "I need to tell you something," she began, watching his expression shift from warm welcome to concerned attention as he registered the seriousness in her tone. She recounted the overheard conversation carefully, watching Draven's jaw tighten with obvious anger as she described the implications of continued political instability surrounding her presence in the castle. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly once she'd finished. "I will address this directly, with both Lady Vesna and whoever else was involved in that conversation. I refuse to allow continued whispered threats against your safety or against our relationship." "Draven," Elira said carefully, "perhaps addressing it directly isn't the solution this situation requires." "What do you mean?" "I mean that regardless of how firmly you declare your intentions, regardless of how directly you address these concerns, the fundamental problem remains unchanged," Elira explained, her voice growing steadier as she articulated fears she had been carrying since her return to the castle. "My presence here continues, providing Corwin with political ammunition to destabilize your alliances. That reality doesn't change simply because you've publicly declared your feelings for me." "So what would you have me do?" Draven asked, frustration evident in his tone. "Send you away again? Continue allowing political pressure to dictate the terms of our happiness indefinitely?" "I don't know," Elira admitted honestly. "But I fear that continuing as we have been, hoping the political concerns will simply resolve themselves over time, might be placing your entire kingdom at unnecessary risk." They argued gently but persistently late into the evening, neither willing to simply accept the other's perspective without extensive discussion. Draven remained adamant that he refused to sacrifice their relationship to political pressure, while Elira grew increasingly convinced that her continued presence represented a genuine strategic vulnerability that Corwin would continue exploiting, regardless of Draven's personal declarations. Eventually, exhausted by the emotional intensity of their discussion, they agreed to table the conversation for the evening, though neither felt entirely resolved about the path forward. Draven walked her to her room, his expression troubled despite his obvious attempts to project confidence about their future together. "Whatever happens," he said quietly at her door, "I need you to understand that I love you completely, Elira. Nothing that happens tomorrow, or any day after, changes that fundamental truth." "I love you too," Elira replied, though her heart carried a heaviness she couldn't quite explain, an intuition she didn't yet fully understand, but that left her feeling unsettled despite Draven's reassuring words. "Get some rest," Draven said, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "We'll figure out a solution together. I promise you that." After he departed, Elira lay awake for hours, her mind racing through countless possibilities and fears about the days ahead. She thought about Corwin's continued manipulation, about the thousands of innocent lives that remained vulnerable should renewed conflict erupt because of political instability she had inadvertently created through her simple presence in Draven's castle. She thought about Lady Vesna's genuine concern, about the unfamiliar advisor's darker suggestion that the decision might need to be taken from Draven's hands entirely if he continued refusing to acknowledge the political danger. Most painfully, she thought about Kira, Draven's sister who had been kidnapped and ultimately lost because of similar political vulnerabilities that Corwin had previously exploited. Was history destined to repeat itself? this time with Alira herself becoming the target of Corwin's manipulation, potentially endangering not just herself, but the entire kingdom Draven had sworn to protect. Sometime near midnight, unable to quiet her racing thoughts, Alira rose from her bed and made her way quietly through the darkened castle corridors, seeking the solitude of the small library, where she and Draven had shared so many meaningful conversations during the early weeks of their relationship. She settled into a familiar chair near the cold hearth, pulling a heavy blanket around her shoulders against the evening chill, and allowed herself to fully confront the impossible choice that seemed to be crystallizing in her mind, despite every instinct urging her to simply trust Draven's promise that they would find a solution together. She loved him. She loved him more deeply than she had ever imagined loving another person, had built an entire vision of their shared future together during the painful months of separation in Hollow Creek. But she also understood, with painful clarity, the genuine danger her continued presence created for everything Draven had sworn to protect. Thousands of lives, an entire kingdom's stability, all potentially threatened by political vulnerabilities that Corwin would continue exploiting, regardless of how firmly Draven declared his personal commitment to their relationship. Perhaps, she began to realize with growing dread, the only way to truly protect everyone she cared about, including Draven himself, was to remove herself from the equation entirely. Not through some elaborate political negotiation or carefully managed public relations strategy, but simply and completely, in a way that left no ambiguity for Corwin to exploit, no ongoing vulnerability for enemies to manipulate. The thought terrified her, the prospect of leaving behind everything she had built with Draven, everyone she had come to care for within these castle walls. But as she sat alone in the quiet library, watching moonlight filter through the tall windows, she began to understand with growing certainty that sometimes love required sacrifices that felt impossible to make, choices that broke your own heart, in service of protecting something larger and more important than personal happiness. She thought of her own family, of the pack she had left behind months earlier, of her younger sister who had likely grown considerably during her extended absence. Perhaps there was wisdom in returning to her roots, in removing herself entirely from the political complications that continued threatening Draven's kingdom, even if doing so meant sacrificing the deepest love she had ever known. She sat in that quiet library for hours, wrestling with the impossible decision forming in her mind, until finally, as the first hints of dawn began lightening the sky outside, she reached a conclusion that felt simultaneously devastating and necessary. She would leave. Quietly, completely, without the elaborate political negotiations that had characterized her previous departure to Hollow Creek. She would simply disappear, removing herself entirely from the equation that continued threatening Draven's alliances, and, by extension, the safety of thousands of innocent lives, depending on his continued strength and stability. It would break her heart. It would likely break Draven's heart as well, given everything he had declared about his unwavering commitment to their relationship. But as she finally rose from her chair in the library, her decision made with painful clarity, Alira understood that sometimes protecting the people you loved most required accepting an unbearable sacrifice, walking away from everything you desperately wanted, in service of a greater good that extended far beyond your own personal happiness. She returned to her room as the sky outside continued lightening toward morning, her mind now focused on the practical details of the departure she had decided upon. She would need to leave quietly, before anyone had the opportunity to question or prevent her decision. She would need to travel far enough that Corwin's spies couldn't easily track her whereabouts, couldn't continue using rumors of her location to manipulate the fragile political situation Draven continued navigating. Most painfully, she understood she couldn't tell Draven what she intended to do. He would never accept her decision, would insist on finding alternative solutions, would potentially endanger his entire kingdom through his stubborn refusal to sacrifice their relationship, regardless of the genuine risks involved. The only way to truly protect him, to truly protect everyone depending on his leadership, was to make this impossible choice herself, without giving him the opportunity to talk her out of the sacrifice she now understood was necessary. As dawn approached, Alira began quietly gathering the few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind, her hands trembling with grief, even as her resolve remained firm. She thought of Draven sleeping peacefully in his own chambers, unaware of the devastating decision she had reached during her sleepless night in the library. She thought of the promise he had made just hours earlier, his gentle kiss against her forehead, his insistence that nothing would change the fundamental truth of his love for her. She was about to prove that promise both entirely true and entirely insufficient, given the impossible political circumstances that continued threatening everything he had sworn to protect. With tears streaming silently down her face, Elira finished packing her small bag and moved toward her door, understanding that once she crossed this threshold, there would be no turning back from the painful sacrifice she had chosen to make. Whatever pain this decision caused, whatever heartbreak Draven would experience upon discovering her absence, she told herself repeatedly as she moved quietly through the darkened castle corridors, it remained infinitely preferable to the alternative. Watching Corwin exploit her continued presence to destabilize everything Draven had worked so hard to protect, potentially costing thousands of innocent lives their safety and security, because two people had refused to accept the painful reality of their impossible circumstances. The castle remained silent and still as Elira made her way toward the servants' entrance she remembered from her earliest days within these walls, the same entrance she had first walked through months earlier as an unwilling tribute rather than a woman deeply in love with the complicated, wounded king who ruled this kingdom. As she stepped through the ancient wooden door and into the cool pre-dawn air, Elira allowed herself one final look back at the castle that had become, despite everything, the closest thing to a true home she had known since losing her own family's stability years earlier. Then, with her heart breaking with every step, she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the retreating night, leaving behind the man she loved and the life they had fought so desperately to build together, sacrificing her own happiness in service of a greater good she prayed would ultimately prove worth the devastating cost. Draven's fist slammed against the stone wall, hard enough to split his knuckles open. "Search every corridor," he roared at the assembled guards, his voice carrying a raw desperation none of them had ever witnessed from their composed, controlled king. "Every room, every closet, every inch of this castle, she has to be here somewhere." But Elira wasn't there. Myrna had discovered her empty room shortly after dawn, the bed neatly made, a single folded letter left on the small wooden chest that had once held all of Elira's meager possessions. The older woman's frantic cries had summoned guards throughout the castle, and within minutes, the news had reached Draven, who had rushed from his chambers still half-dressed, disbelief and mounting horror etched across his face as he read the letter with trembling hands. "My dearest Draven," the letter began, and Elira's careful handwriting blurred before his eyes as he continued reading. "By the time you find this, I will already be gone, and I need you to understand that this decision comes from the deepest love I have ever known, not from any lack of commitment to what we built together. I overheard enough last night to understand that my continued presence threatens everything you've worked so hard to protect. Corwin will continue exploiting my presence to destabilize your alliances, regardless of how firmly you declare your feelings for me, regardless of how many political battles you fight on my behalf. I cannot allow that danger to continue, not when thousands of innocent lives depend on your strength and stability. Please don't try to find me. I need you to focus entirely on protecting your kingdom, on maintaining the alliances that will keep your people safe from Corwin's continued ambitions. I will find my own way forward, somewhere far from the political complications that continue threatening what we built together. I love you, Draven. I will always love you. But sometimes love requires sacrifices that break our own hearts, in service of something greater than ourselves. Please forgive me for making this choice without giving you the opportunity to argue against it. I knew, with absolute certainty, that you would never have allowed me to leave if I had asked your permission first. Be well, my love. Protect your people. And please, someday, forgive me for this final act of love that I could only express through leaving rather than staying. Yours always, Elira." Draven read the letter 3 times before the words truly registered, before the devastating reality of her absence fully crashed through the numbing shock that had initially gripped him. Then something within him broke entirely, years of careful control and composed authority shattering as raw grief and fury took hold. "Find her," he commanded, his voice shaking with barely controlled emotion as guards scrambled to organize search parties throughout the castle grounds. "I don't care what resources it requires. Find her immediately." The following hours brought increasingly desperate searching throughout the castle and surrounding grounds, though it quickly became apparent that Alira had planned her departure with careful deliberation, leaving no obvious trail for guards to follow. She had taken only essential possessions, had apparently slipped away sometime during the deepest hours of the night when castle security remained at its most minimal, and had somehow managed to disappear without triggering any of the alarm systems typically employed to protect against unauthorized departures. Draven personally led search efforts into the surrounding forest and countryside, his desperation growing with each passing hour that failed to produce any concrete evidence of Alira's whereabouts. He questioned every guard who had been on duty during the night, every servant who might have witnessed her departure, but no one had seen anything unusual. No one could provide any useful information about which direction she might have traveled, or what her ultimate destination might be. By midday, exhausted and increasingly desperate, Draven called an emergency council meeting, his composed authority replaced by barely controlled fury and grief that left his advisors exchanging worried glances throughout the tense gathering. "I want every available resource dedicated to finding her," he announced, his voice carrying an edge that brooked no argument. "Guards, scouts, whatever tracking specialists we can secure. She cannot have traveled far without proper supplies or protection." Lady Vesna, present among the gathered advisors, spoke carefully, clearly aware of the delicate nature of addressing the king during such an emotionally raw moment. "My king, I understand your distress, but I must ask whether dedicating such extensive resources to this search remains strategically wise, given our continued need to monitor Corwin's activities and maintain our defensive preparations." "I don't care about strategic wisdom right now," Draven snapped, his temper fraying dangerously thin. "The woman I love has disappeared, likely believing she needed to sacrifice her own happiness and safety to protect my kingdom from political complications that I should have resolved more effectively. I will not simply abandon her to whatever dangers await someone traveling alone through potentially hostile territory." The council chamber fell silent, several advisors clearly uncomfortable witnessing their normally controlled king's obvious emotional distress. Lady Vesna, to her credit, didn't argue further, though her expression suggested continued concern about balancing the search efforts against other pressing strategic priorities. Over the following days, Draven organized increasingly extensive search parties, dispatching scouts to nearby villages and towns, questioning travelers and merchants who might have encountered a lone woman, matching Alira's description. But the search yielded frustratingly little useful information. It was as though Alira had simply vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of her passage through the surrounding countryside. Myrna proved a constant source of comfort during these difficult days, though her own grief at losing the young woman she had come to consider almost a daughter remained evident in her worried expression and frequent tears. She spent hours with Draven, reviewing every detail of Alira's final days in the castle, searching for any small clue that might provide direction for the ongoing search efforts. She mentioned once, early in her stay here, missing her younger sister terribly, Myrna offered during one such conversation, nearly a week after Alira's disappearance. "Perhaps she's returned to her home pack, seeking the comfort of family during this difficult time." Draven immediately dispatched riders toward Ashwood Pack, Alira's home territory, though he harbored little genuine hope that she would have returned somewhere so obvious, somewhere Corwin's spies might easily locate her if they continued monitoring her whereabouts. His fears proved correct when the riders returned nearly 2 weeks later, reporting that Alira's family had received no word from her since her original departure to fulfill her pack's tribute obligation months earlier. The failure of this search avenue sent Draven spiraling into deeper despair, his obsessive focus on finding Alira beginning to noticeably affect his ability to manage his kingdom's ongoing political and military concerns. Advisors grew increasingly worried about his neglected responsibilities, about council meetings he canceled or attended with obvious distraction, about strategic decisions that required his careful attention, but instead received only cursory consideration, as his mind remained consumed with worry for Alira's safety and whereabouts. "My king," Lady Vesna finally said during a particularly tense council meeting nearly a month after Alira's disappearance, "I understand your continued distress, but your kingdom requires your full attention and leadership. Corwin's forces remain active despite our current truce, and several strategic decisions cannot continue being delayed indefinitely." "I am aware of my responsibilities," Draven replied, his voice tight with exhaustion and grief he had been carrying largely alone for weeks now. But I cannot simply abandon the search for Alira either. She left believing she was protecting my kingdom through her sacrifice, and I refuse to honor that sacrifice by allowing her to remain missing, potentially in danger, while I focus exclusively on political matters. Perhaps, another advisor suggested carefully, a compromise might serve both concerns. Dedicated search teams could continue investigating her whereabouts, while you return your primary focus to kingdom governance. Draven considered this suggestion for a long moment, clearly torn between his desperate need to personally lead the search efforts and his genuine understanding that his kingdom required his continued leadership during an uncertain political period. Eventually, he reluctantly agreed to the compromise, organizing a dedicated search team, led by his most trusted warrior, a seasoned tracker named Aldrich, while he himself returned to managing the day-to-day governance responsibilities that continued demanding his attention. But even as he outwardly resumed his kingly duties, Draven's obsession with finding Alira never truly diminished. He met with Aldrich daily, reviewing search progress with an intensity that left the experienced tracker slightly unnerved by his king's obvious desperation. He personally reviewed every report from villages and territories where Alira might have potentially traveled, questioned every rumor or possible sighting with meticulous attention to detail. Months passed with agonizing slowness. Spring gave way to summer, and still no concrete evidence emerged regarding Alira's true whereabouts. Draven's grief gradually transformed into a kind of grim determination, a refusal to accept that she might be permanently lost to him, despite the mounting evidence suggesting she had successfully disappeared, without leaving any traceable path. He began personally joining search expeditions whenever his kingdom's other responsibilities allowed, traveling to distant villages and territories based on the flimsiest rumors of a woman matching Alira's description. These expeditions consistently proved fruitless, each disappointment adding to the accumulating weight of grief and desperation he carried, though he refused to abandon hope entirely, refused to accept that the woman he loved might be permanently gone from his life. During one such expedition, nearly 4 months after Alira's disappearance, Draven finally uncovered his first genuine lead. A merchant traveling through a distant trading post reported encountering a young woman matching Alira's description several months earlier, though the merchant couldn't provide specific details about her current location or ultimate destination. She was asking about work, the merchant recalled, during Draven's intense questioning, said she had experience with herbs and healing, was looking for a village that might need those particular skills. The information, though frustratingly vague, provided Draven's first genuine hope in months that Alira remained alive and had successfully avoided whatever dangers might have threatened her during her journey away from the castle. He redoubled search efforts throughout the region the merchant had described, questioning countless villages and towns, though the trail eventually grew cold once again, as weeks passed without additional confirmed sightings. Throughout these months of desperate searching, Draven's advisors grew increasingly concerned about the toll this ongoing obsession was taking on both his physical health and his effectiveness as their kingdom's leader. Lady Vesna, despite her earlier concerns about the political complications Alira's presence had created, found herself surprisingly sympathetic to his continued grief, understanding perhaps better than most the genuine depth of feeling that had developed between the king and the woman who had captured his heart so completely. "He has changed since her disappearance," Lady Vesna confided to Myrna during one of their occasional conversations about the king's continued distress. "The coldness that once characterized his leadership has been replaced by something far more raw and vulnerable. I confess, I worry about him continuing this way indefinitely." "Love changes people," Myrna replied simply, her own grief for the young woman she had cared for deeply remaining evident, despite the months that had passed since her disappearance. Sometimes for better, sometimes in ways that create new vulnerabilities we hadn't previously considered. "I only hope, for both their sakes, that Alira remains safe wherever she has chosen to hide herself away." As summer gave way to autumn, and autumn eventually surrendered to winter's approaching chill, Draven's search for Alira continued unabated, though the specific leads and possibilities had grown increasingly sparse. He had traveled personally to dozens of villages and territories, had questioned hundreds of travelers and merchants, had exhausted seemingly every reasonable avenue of investigation, without discovering concrete evidence of her current whereabouts. Yet he refused to abandon hope, refused to accept that Alira might be permanently lost to him, despite the mounting frustration and grief accompanying each failed search expedition. He carried her memory with him constantly, revisiting their conversations, their shared moments of vulnerability and connection, drawing strength from the genuine love they had shared, despite the impossible circumstances that had ultimately separated them. As the one-year anniversary of her disappearance approached, Draven found himself once again preparing for another search expedition, this time based on a promising lead suggesting a woman matching Alira's description had settled in a distant village, nearly at the edge of his kingdom's known territories. His advisors had grown weary of these repeated expeditions, though none dared voice open criticism given the obvious depth of their king's continued devotion to finding the woman he loved. This might finally be it, Aldrich said as they prepared for departure, his experienced tracker's instincts suggesting this particular lead carried more credibility than previous false hopes they had chased throughout the preceding months. Draven said nothing in response, though the fierce determination, evident in his storm-gray eyes, suggested he shared Aldrich's cautious optimism, refused to allow himself to fully hope, given the repeated disappointments of the preceding year, yet unable to entirely suppress the desperate longing that continued driving his relentless search for the woman who had sacrificed her own happiness in a misguided attempt to protect his kingdom from political dangers he now understood he should have addressed more directly and effectively from the very beginning. As his search party departed the castle grounds that morning, Draven allowed himself one final thought before focusing entirely on the journey ahead. Whatever this expedition ultimately revealed, whether it finally led him to Alira or resulted in yet another painful disappointment, he understood with absolute certainty that he would never stop searching, would never abandon hope of eventually reuniting with the woman who had taught him that love, genuine love, remained worth fighting for, regardless of the political complications and dangers that might attempt to keep two hearts permanently separated. Alira pressed herself flat against the cold stone wall, her heart pounding, as heavy footsteps passed just beyond the narrow alley where she had taken refuge. 3 months had passed since her departure from Draven's castle, and she had grown accustomed to this particular kind of fear, the constant vigilance required to avoid recognition, the careful attention needed to ensure she left no obvious trail that Corwin's spies or Draven's search parties might eventually discover. She had heard rumors, whispered among travelers and merchants she encountered during her constant movement between villages and towns, that the Alpha King had dispatched extensive search efforts to locate a woman matching her general description. The knowledge that Draven continued searching for her, months after her departure, created a painful ache in her chest that never fully disappeared, regardless of how firmly she reminded herself of the necessary sacrifice her disappearance represented. She missed him with an intensity that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her careful composure, missed his storm-gray eyes and his gentle strength, missed the quiet conversations they had shared during the brief months of their relationship, before political circumstances had forced her impossible decision. But she had made her choice, and she remained determined to honor that sacrifice by ensuring she remained genuinely lost to him, regardless of the personal cost involved. Her journey following her departure from the castle had taken her through numerous small villages and towns, never remaining in any single location long enough to establish the kind of permanent presence that might eventually attract unwanted attention. She had used her limited healing knowledge, skills she had learned from her mother during childhood, to earn modest income helping treat minor illnesses and injuries among villagers who asked few questions about her mysterious background or reasons for constant travel. The work proved genuinely fulfilling, despite the underlying loneliness and fear that colored her daily existence. She found purpose in helping others, in using practical skills to make tangible differences in the lives of ordinary people struggling with illness or injury. It provided a welcome distraction from the persistent grief and longing that continued accompanying thoughts of the life she had sacrificed, the love she had walked away from in service of protecting Draven's kingdom. 6 months into her self-imposed exile, Alira arrived in a modest village called Fernbrook, nestled deep within a forested valley, far removed from the political conflicts and dangers that had characterized her previous life. She had chosen this particular destination somewhat randomly, following vague directions from a traveling merchant who had mentioned the village's need for additional healing expertise following a recent illness that had swept through the local population. The village elder, an elderly woman named Grethel, welcomed Alira with genuine warmth, offering both practical assistance in establishing herself within the community, and gentle acceptance of Alira's obvious reluctance to discuss her past circumstances in detail. Everyone who arrives in Fernbrook carries their own private burdens, Grethel observed during one of their early conversations, her wise eyes suggesting she understood far more about Alira's obvious emotional pain than the younger woman had explicitly revealed. We don't require detailed explanations here, child, only genuine effort and respectful behavior toward your fellow villagers. Alira found herself grateful for Grethel's understanding discretion, gradually settling into a quiet, purposeful existence within the small community. She established a modest healing practice, treating various illnesses and injuries among the village's population, while carefully maintaining the anonymity that remained essential to her continued safety and Draven's political security. Despite the relative peace she found within Fernbrook's welcoming community, the persistent ache of missing Draven never fully diminished. She thought of him constantly, wondering how he was managing his kingdom's ongoing challenges, whether the political pressures that had necessitated her departure had finally resolved themselves in his favor, whether he had perhaps moved forward with his life despite her absence, potentially finding comfort and companionship with someone whose presence didn't create the same dangerous political complications she had represented. The thought of Draven finding happiness with someone else caused genuine physical pain, though Alira forced herself to acknowledge this possibility as a natural, even desirable outcome, given the sacrifice she had made specifically to protect his kingdom's stability. If her disappearance ultimately allowed him to find lasting happiness and security, whether through eventual reunion with her or through an entirely different path forward, then perhaps her painful sacrifice would prove genuinely worthwhile despite the personal cost involved. Nearly 8 months into her exile, Alira experienced her first genuine scare regarding potential discovery. A group of unfamiliar riders passed through Fernbrook, their formal bearing and careful questions about recent arrivals to the village immediately triggering her carefully honed instincts for danger. She retreated to Grethel's cottage, remaining hidden throughout their brief visit, her heart pounding with fear that Draven's search efforts had finally located her true whereabouts. They were asking about a young healer who might have arrived within the past several months, Grethel reported, once the riders had departed, her expression carrying obvious concern for Alira's evident distress. I told them we had employed several new residents recently, though I was deliberately vague about specific details that might identify you directly. Thank you, Alira said, though her hands trembled slightly as she processed how close this encounter had come to potentially exposing her carefully maintained anonymity. I need to consider whether remaining in Fernbrook continues to be safe, given this apparent search effort. Grethel studied her carefully, clearly recognizing the genuine distress underlying Alira's careful composure. May I ask, child, who exactly you're hiding from? Perhaps understanding your true circumstances might help me offer more useful guidance regarding your continued safety. Alira hesitated for a long moment, weighing the wisdom of finally sharing her true story with someone who had shown genuine kindness throughout her months in Fernbrook. Eventually, exhausted by months of carrying this burden entirely alone, she found herself confiding the full truth to Grethel, describing her relationship with Draven, the political complications that had necessitated her difficult sacrifice, and her continued fear that discovery might reignite the dangerous political instability she had specifically sought to prevent through her disappearance. Grethel listened carefully throughout Alira's lengthy explanation, her expression shifting through various emotions as she absorbed the complicated, painful story. When Alira finally finished, the elderly woman remained quiet for a long moment, clearly considering her response carefully. You made a difficult choice, child, sacrificing your own happiness in service of protecting people you cared about, Grethel finally said. That kind of selfless love deserves genuine respect and admiration. But I must ask, have you considered whether your continued absence truly serves its intended purpose, or whether perhaps circumstances have changed sufficiently that returning might no longer create the same dangers you originally feared? The question struck Alira with unexpected force, forcing her to confront possibilities she had carefully avoided considering during her months of self-imposed exile. She had assumed, without genuine verification, that the political dangers necessitating her departure remained unchanged, that Corwin continued actively exploiting rumors of her relationship with Draven to destabilize his alliances. But nearly 8 months had passed since her departure. Political circumstances, military conflicts, alliance structures, all of these elements could have shifted significantly during such an extended period, potentially rendering her continued sacrifice unnecessary or even counterproductive, given how deeply her absence had apparently affected Draven's own effectiveness as a leader, based on the persistent search efforts that continued suggesting his ongoing distress. "I don't know," Illyra admitted honestly. "I made my decision based on the circumstances I understood at the time, but I genuinely don't know whether those circumstances remain unchanged given the months that have passed." "Perhaps," Grethel suggested gently, "that uncertainty itself deserves careful consideration, rather than simply assuming your original sacrifice must continue indefinitely, regardless of how circumstances might have evolved." Illyra spent the following weeks wrestling with this new uncertainty, torn between her original conviction that remaining hidden represented the only responsible choice, and Grethel's suggestion that circumstances might have genuinely changed enough to warrant reconsidering her continued exile. She found herself paying closer attention to news and rumors carried by traveling merchants and visitors to Fernbrook, seeking any information that might clarify the current political situation surrounding Draven's kingdom. The information she gathered remained frustratingly incomplete, though certain patterns gradually emerged that suggested significant developments had indeed occurred during her extended absence. She learned that the truce with Corwin's forces had apparently held steady throughout the preceding months, suggesting perhaps that the immediate military crisis that had originally complicated her relationship with Draven had genuinely stabilized. She also heard whispered rumors, impossible to verify but persistently repeated among travelers, describing the Alpha King's continued melancholy and apparently unwavering dedication to locating a woman who had mysteriously disappeared from his castle nearly a year earlier. These fragments of information created a complicated mixture of hope and continued uncertainty within Illyra's heart. Perhaps circumstances truly had changed sufficiently that her return might no longer create the same dangerous political vulnerabilities she had originally feared. But she also recognized the very real possibility that returning prematurely, before genuinely verifying that political circumstances had stabilized, might reignite exactly the dangers she had sacrificed so much to prevent. As the one-year anniversary of her departure approached, Illyra found herself increasingly consumed by this internal conflict, torn between her persistent longing to return to Draven and her continued fear that doing so might endanger everything she had sacrificed to protect. She confided her uncertainty to Grethel repeatedly during this period, seeking wisdom and guidance from the elderly woman who had become something of a trusted confidant during her months in Fernbrook. "Sometimes," Grethel offered, during one particularly emotional conversation, "we must accept that we cannot achieve perfect certainty before making important decisions. You sacrificed your own happiness based on genuine concern for protecting people you loved, and that sacrifice deserves respect, regardless of how circumstances might have subsequently evolved. But perhaps it's time to consider whether continuing that sacrifice indefinitely, without genuine verification that it remains necessary, might itself become a kind of mistake, potentially depriving both yourself and the man you love of a happiness you both clearly deserve." Illyra turned these words over repeatedly during the following days, gradually recognizing the wisdom underlying Grethel's gentle guidance. She had made her original decision based on genuine love and concern for protecting Draven's kingdom from political dangers that had felt immediate and unavoidable at the time. But perhaps continuing that sacrifice indefinitely, without seeking genuine confirmation about whether circumstances had changed sufficiently to allow their reunion, represented its own kind of failure. A failure to trust that love and careful communication might ultimately find solutions that pure sacrifice and separation could never achieve. As autumn began transitioning toward the anniversary of her fateful departure, Illyra made a new decision, one that felt equally significant to her original choice to leave, though it carried an entirely different emotional weight. She would seek out reliable information about the current political situation surrounding Draven's kingdom, would attempt to genuinely verify whether circumstances had evolved sufficiently to make their reunion possible without recreating the dangerous vulnerabilities that had originally necessitated her painful sacrifice. If circumstances remained genuinely dangerous, she would honor her original commitment to remaining apart from Draven, regardless of how deeply that continued separation pained her. But if genuine verification suggested that political circumstances had stabilized sufficiently, she would finally allow herself to consider the possibility of returning to the man she had never stopped loving, despite the year of painful separation that continued weighing heavily on both their hearts. With this new resolve firmly established, Alira began carefully planning her next steps, understanding that whatever she ultimately decided would prove significant not just for her own future happiness, but potentially for the continued stability of an entire kingdom that remained deeply intertwined with the fate of her relationship with its complicated, wounded, but genuinely loving king. Aldrich's horse thundered to a stop in the castle courtyard, the experienced tracker practically leaping from the saddle before the animal had fully halted. "My king," he called out, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately caught Draven's attention as he emerged from the castle's main entrance. "We've found something significant, a healer matching Alira's description, operating in a village called Fernbrook for the past several months." Draven's heart leapt, with a hope he had carefully guarded against for nearly a year of repeated disappointments. "Are you certain this time?" "More certain than any previous lead we've pursued," Aldrich confirmed, still slightly breathless from his hurried journey back to the castle. "The description matches precisely, and villagers report she arrived approximately 6 months ago, established herself as a skilled healer, and has maintained a notably private, cautious demeanor throughout her time there." The details aligned perfectly with everything Draven understood about Alira's likely behavior during her extended absence, her natural inclination toward healing work stemming from skills learned during childhood, her understandable caution about maintaining anonymity, given the political complications that had necessitated her original departure. "Prepare a search party immediately," Draven commanded, though his voice carried a controlled intensity that suggested the depth of emotion he was carefully managing beneath his composed exterior. "I want to depart within the hour." As preparations proceeded rapidly throughout the castle, Draven found himself confronting complicated emotions he hadn't fully processed during the preceding months of relentless searching. Nearly a year had passed since Alira's disappearance, a year during which he had transformed from the cold, guarded king who had originally dismissed her as merely political tribute into someone who understood, with painful clarity, exactly how much genuine love could reshape a person's entire perspective on life and leadership. He had made significant changes throughout the kingdom during her absence, changes he hoped might eventually allow their reunion to occur, without recreating the same dangerous political vulnerabilities that had originally forced her impossible sacrifice. He had worked diligently to strengthen alliances through means beyond simple personal relationships, had demonstrated consistent strategic wisdom throughout the ongoing tension with Corwin's forces, had gradually rebuilt trust with allied pacts who had previously expressed concerns about his judgment being compromised by personal attachments. Most significantly, he had directly addressed Corwin's continued attempts to exploit political vulnerabilities, working with allied pack leaders to develop stronger, more resilient alliance structures that couldn't be easily destabilized through rumors or manipulation regarding his personal relationships. These efforts had gradually strengthened his kingdom's overall political stability, potentially creating exactly the circumstances that might finally allow Alira's return, without recreating the original dangers that had necessitated her painful sacrifice. Whether these changes would prove sufficient remained uncertain, but Draven understood, as his search party finally departed the castle grounds heading toward Fernbrook, that he was prepared to fight for his relationship with Alira, regardless of whatever political complications might still exist. He had spent a full year learning to live with the devastating grief of her absence, had transformed his entire approach to leadership through the painful lessons of that separation, and he refused to allow any remaining political concerns to prevent their reunion if she truly remained in Fernbrook, as Aldrich's investigation suggested. The journey toward Fernbrook took 3 days, each hour feeling like an eternity, as Draven's anticipation and anxiety continued building steadily. He rode largely in silence, his mind consumed with countless questions about what he might discover upon finally reaching the village. Would Alira welcome his arrival, or would she view his search as a violation of the sacrifice she had made specifically to protect his kingdom's stability? Had the year of separation changed her feelings toward him, perhaps causing her to build a new life that no longer included space for their previous relationship? Would she even still be present in Fernbrook by the time his search party arrived, or might she have already moved on to another location, given her apparent pattern of frequent relocation throughout her months of exile? These uncertain questions consumed his thoughts throughout the journey, though he refused to allow doubt to diminish his fierce determination to finally reunite with the woman he had never stopped loving, despite the painful year of separation. Meanwhile, in Fernbrook, Elira remained unaware of the search party rapidly approaching her adopted village, continuing her careful deliberation about whether circumstances had genuinely evolved sufficiently to consider returning to Draven's castle. She had spent recent weeks cautiously gathering information from traveling merchants and visitors, piecing together a picture of the current political situation that suggested significant positive developments throughout the preceding months. The truce with Corwin appeared to have solidified into something resembling genuine, if uneasy, peace. Draven's alliances with neighboring pacts seemed considerably more stable than during the tumultuous period that had originally necessitated her departure. Several merchants had even mentioned, in passing conversation, admiring comments about the Alpha King's strengthened leadership and strategic wisdom throughout the preceding year, suggesting he had successfully navigated whatever political challenges remained, despite the personal grief he had apparently continued carrying regarding her mysterious disappearance. This accumulating evidence gradually strengthened Elira's growing conviction that perhaps enough time had passed, perhaps circumstances had genuinely evolved sufficiently, that returning to Draven might no longer create the dangerous political vulnerabilities she had originally feared. She had begun seriously planning her own journey back toward his castle, intending to seek him out directly, rather than continuing to rely on second-hand information and speculation about the current political landscape. She was in the midst of these careful preparations, discussing her intentions with Grethel during a quiet evening conversation in the elderly woman's cottage, when the sound of approaching riders drew both their attention toward the village's main road. "Riders," Grethel observed, moving toward her window to investigate the unusual disturbance. A significant number, judging by the sound. Elira's heart began pounding with immediate, instinctive fear, old habits of caution and vigilance reasserting themselves, despite her recent conviction that danger might no longer be imminent. "How many? Do you recognize their bearing?" Grethel peered carefully through the darkening evening light, her expression shifting as she studied the approaching group more closely. "They carry formal banners, child. This appears to be an official delegation, rather than simple travelers or merchants." Fear and hope collided violently within Elira's chest as she processed this information, understanding immediately that such formal riders likely represented either genuine danger from Corwin's forces, or, perhaps, exactly the search party she had gradually come to suspect might eventually locate her, despite her careful precautions throughout the preceding year. "I need to see them," she said, moving toward the door, despite Grethel's obvious concern about the wisdom of revealing herself before understanding the rider's true purpose and identity. "Be careful, child," Grethel cautioned. "We don't yet know their intentions." Elira nodded, though her feet carried her toward the village's main gathering area, regardless of the elderly woman's caution, some instinctive certainty driving her forward, despite the obvious risks involved. As she approached the growing crowd of curious villagers gathering to observe the unusual arrival, her breath caught painfully in her throat as she finally recognized the lead rider dismounting near the village center. Draven. He looked different than she remembered, his features carrying new lines of exhaustion and grief that hadn't existed during their time together nearly a year earlier. Yet his presence remained unmistakably, powerfully familiar despite these subtle changes. His storm-gray eyes swept across the gathered crowd with obvious urgent purpose, searching for something, or someone, with an intensity that immediately captured everyone's attention. Their eyes met across the crowded village square, and time seemed to stop entirely as recognition dawned simultaneously on both their faces. "Elira," Draven breathed, his voice barely audible yet somehow carrying clearly across the sudden silence that had fallen over the gathered crowd. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the sudden reality of his presence, after nearly a year of painful separation and uncertain longing. He crossed the distance between them with rapid, purposeful strides, his composed authority completely abandoned as raw emotion flooded across his previously guarded features. "You're here," he said, stopping just before her, his hands hovering uncertainly, as though afraid she might disappear again if he attempted to touch her. "I've searched for you for an entire year, Elira. I never stopped believing I would eventually find you." "Draven," she whispered, tears building rapidly as the accumulated weight of their painful separation finally overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. I was planning to return to you. I had just decided, only this evening, that enough time might have passed for us to safely reunite. His expression shifted through various emotions, relief and joy mixing with obvious pain at the reminder of how much time had already been lost between them. Why did you leave without allowing me the opportunity to find a solution together? I would have found a way to protect our relationship without requiring such a devastating sacrifice. I know that now, Elira admitted, her voice thick with emotion. But at the time, the danger felt so immediate, so certain, that I convinced myself removing myself entirely represented the only responsible choice available to us. Draven finally closed the remaining distance between them, pulling her into an embrace so tight it nearly stole the breath from her lungs, though she welcomed the overwhelming sensation after so many months of painful longing and uncertainty. I understand your reasoning, even if I wish desperately that you had trusted me enough to find a solution together, rather than sacrificing yourself so completely. I'm sorry, she whispered against his chest, tears now flowing freely, as months of accumulated grief and longing finally found release. I'm so sorry for the pain my absence caused you. You're here now, Draven said firmly, pulling back slightly to study her face with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing every detail after so many months of desperate searching. That's what matters most in this moment. They remained embraced for a long moment, oblivious to the curious crowd of villagers watching their emotional reunion with obvious fascination, before Draven finally pulled back enough to properly address the practical concerns that had originally necessitated her difficult sacrifice. I need you to understand something important, he said seriously. The political circumstances that originally forced your departure have changed significantly during your absence. I've worked diligently throughout this past year to strengthen our alliances through means beyond simple personal relationships, to demonstrate strategic wisdom and leadership that has gradually rebuilt trust with allied pacts, who previously expressed concerns about my judgment. I had heard rumors suggesting similar developments, Elira admitted, though I wasn't entirely certain how much weight to place on second-hand information from traveling merchants. It's true, Draven confirmed. Corwin's forces remain quiet, our truce has solidified into something approaching genuine stability, and our alliance network has grown considerably stronger throughout the preceding months. I believe, with genuine confidence, that circumstances have evolved sufficiently to allow our relationship to continue without recreating the original dangers that necessitated your painful sacrifice. Hope flooded through Elira's chest as she absorbed this confirmation, understanding that her careful information gathering and growing conviction about returning to Draven had been fundamentally correct, that circumstances truly had changed enough to make their reunion possible without endangering everything he had worked so hard to protect. Then perhaps, she said softly, allowing herself to finally voice the hope she had been carefully nurturing throughout recent weeks, we might finally build the future together that we both deserve, without the political complications that originally forced us apart. I would like nothing more, Draven replied, his voice carrying fierce, unwavering conviction despite the emotional vulnerability evident in his expression. I've spent this entire year learning to live with your absence, learning painful lessons about leadership and sacrifice that have fundamentally changed how I approach my responsibilities as king. But throughout every difficult day, every failed search expedition, every moment of accumulated grief, I never once considered abandoning hope of eventually finding you and bringing you home where you belong. Grethel, who had followed Elira toward the village square upon witnessing the emotional reunion unfolding, approached carefully, offering a warm, knowing smile toward both Elira and the obviously significant man who had finally located her after such an extensive search. Perhaps, the elderly woman suggested gently, you two might benefit from a private conversation, away from the curious eyes of our entire village population. Draven turned toward Grethel, offering a grateful nod, despite his obvious continued focus on Elira. Thank you for your kindness toward Elira throughout her time here. I understand she found genuine comfort and purpose within your community during this difficult period. She has been a blessing to Fernbrook, Grethel replied warmly, though I confess, I'm equally pleased to witness her finally finding her way back to the happiness she clearly deserves. As the crowd of curious villagers gradually dispersed, Respecting the obvious need for privacy during such an emotionally significant reunion, Draven and Alira found themselves alone, near the edge of the village square, finally able to speak freely about the profound implications of their unexpected reunion after nearly a year of painful separation. "I have so many questions," Alira admitted, "about everything that's happened during my absence, about how you managed to finally locate me after searching for so long. And I have questions of my own," Draven replied, "about your journey throughout this past year, about the life you built for yourself while separated from everything and everyone you previously knew." "Perhaps," Alira suggested softly, "we have time now to answer all those questions together, rather than continuing to navigate our futures separately." Draven's expression softened with profound relief and joy at her words, understanding the significant implications underlying her simple suggestion. "I would like that very much, Alira. More than you likely realize." As evening settled fully over Fernbrook, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that reminded Alira somewhat painfully of sunsets she had witnessed from her small castle room during the earliest days of her complicated relationship with Draven, she found herself finally allowing genuine hope to flourish within her heart. Whatever challenges still remained ahead, whatever adjustments would be required to successfully rebuild their relationship after such an extensive separation, she understood with growing certainty that they would face those challenges together, their love having survived the ultimate test of an entire year's painful separation and uncertain longing. The path forward remained uncertain in many practical details, but as Draven reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together with the same tender intimacy she remembered from their earliest days together, Alira understood that whatever difficulties awaited their reunion, they would navigate them as genuine partners, their love having proven strong enough to survive even the most devastating challenges that fate and political circumstance had thrown against it. The castle gates opened wide to receive them, and this time, unlike her original tearful departure, or even her tentative return months earlier, Alira crossed the familiar threshold with genuine confidence about the future awaiting her within these ancient stone walls. News of her return had apparently traveled ahead of their arrival, and the castle courtyard was filled with familiar faces gathered to witness this long-awaited reunion. Myrna rushed forward the moment Alira dismounted, embracing her tightly, with tears streaming freely down her weathered cheeks. "I never stopped believing you would return," the older woman whispered, holding Alira close. "The king searched for you every single day, dear. Every single day, for an entire year." "I know," Alira replied, her own tears mixing with Myrna's, as the profound emotion of the moment overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. "I'm so sorry for the pain my absence caused everyone who cared about me here." "You're home now," Myrna said firmly. "That's what truly matters." The stable boy, now considerably taller and more confident than the frightened child Alira had once defended, approached shyly with a small bouquet of wildflowers, a gesture that immediately brought fresh tears to her eyes, given how perfectly it echoed the similar gift he had offered following her earlier, temporary absence. "Welcome home," he said simply, offering the flowers with a genuine smile that suggested his gratitude for her original kindness had never diminished, despite the significant time that had passed. As Draven guided her through the familiar castle corridors, various advisors and staff members offered warm welcomes that carried none of the earlier political tension and reservation that had characterized her original arrival months earlier. Even Lady Vesna, waiting near the entrance to the main council chamber, approached with an expression suggesting genuine relief and welcome rather than the cautious political calculation Alira remembered from their earlier interactions. "I owe you an apology," Lady Vesna said carefully, once Draven had briefly stepped away to address urgent castle matters requiring his immediate attention. "I allowed political concerns to overshadow genuine compassion for the profound love you and the king clearly shared. Watching him endure this past year, watching his obvious grief and unwavering determination to find you, taught me valuable lessons about the true costs of prioritizing political calculation over authentic human connection." "Thank you for that acknowledgement," Alira replied warmly, understanding that Lady Vesna's earlier concerns, while painful to experience, had ultimately stemmed from genuine dedication to protecting Draven's kingdom, rather than any personal animosity toward their relationship. "I understand the difficult position you occupied throughout that period, balancing legitimate political concerns against more personal considerations. Nonetheless, Lady Vesna continued, I hope we might build a more positive relationship moving forward, particularly given the significant role you now occupy within our king's life, and presumably, within our kingdom's future governance structure. The implication underlying Lady Vesna's careful words wasn't lost on Alira, suggesting the political advisor anticipated a formal, permanent relationship between herself and Draven that extended well beyond their earlier, more tentative romantic connection. This realization brought both excitement and renewed uncertainty about what specific form their future together might ultimately take. That evening, after the initial excitement surrounding her return had gradually settled and the castle had returned to its familiar evening rhythms, Draven sought her out in the small library where they had shared so many meaningful conversations during the earliest weeks of their relationship. He found her sitting near the familiar hearth, lost in contemplative thought about everything that had transpired throughout their tumultuous year of separation and unexpected reunion. You seem thoughtful, he observed, settling into the chair beside her with the comfortable familiarity of countless similar evenings they had shared together long ago. I'm simply trying to process everything that's happened, Alira admitted. The past year feels almost like a strange dream now that I'm actually here with you again. I understand that feeling, Draven said softly. Though I confess I've spent considerable time throughout this past year, contemplating exactly what our reunion might eventually mean for our future together, assuming we were fortunate enough to actually experience such a reunion. What conclusions did you reach? Alira asked, curiosity and anticipation mixing within her chest. Draven reached into his cloak, withdrawing a small object that caught the firelight with a subtle golden gleam. I reached the conclusion that I refused to spend another day allowing uncertainty or political complications to prevent me from formally, permanently committing myself to our relationship. He knelt before her chair, opening his palm to reveal a delicate ring, clearly crafted with significant care and attention, despite its relative simplicity, compared to more elaborate royal jewelry Alira might have expected. Elira, he began, his voice carrying obvious emotion despite his obvious attempt to maintain composed dignity during this significant moment. I spent this past year learning countless painful lessons about love, sacrifice, and the genuine cost of allowing fear or political calculation to prevent authentic happiness. I refuse to make that same mistake again. I love you completely, unreservedly, and I want nothing more than to build our future together, formally and permanently, as partners in both love and leadership. Tears streamed freely down Alira's face as she absorbed the profound significance of his words and the beautiful ring he offered. Are you asking what I believe you're asking? I am, Draven confirmed, his storm-gray eyes carrying fierce, unwavering determination, despite the obvious vulnerability of the moment. Will you marry me, Alira? Will you become my queen, my true partner in leading this kingdom, and my wife in every sense that matters most? Yes, Alira breathed immediately, joy overwhelming every lingering uncertainty that had accompanied her return to the castle. Yes, absolutely yes. Draven slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly with obvious emotion, then rose to pull her into a passionate embrace that spoke volumes about the profound love and relief they both experienced, following their unexpected, joyful reunion after such a painful year of separation. I love you, he murmured against her hair, holding her tightly, as though afraid she might disappear again if he released his careful embrace. I love you more than I ever imagined possible, and I promise you, Alira, that we will never again allow political circumstances to force us apart. Whatever challenges arise, we will face them together, as genuine partners committed to protecting both our kingdom and our love equally. I love you too, Alira replied, her voice thick with emotion as she finally allowed herself to fully embrace the happiness she had sacrificed so painfully during their year apart. And I promise you the same commitment, the same refusal to allow fear or uncertainty to separate us again. Their engagement announcement, made formally the following morning during a specially convened council meeting, was met with genuine enthusiasm throughout the castle and surrounding kingdom. The political complications that had originally necessitated Alira's painful departure had genuinely resolved themselves over the preceding year, replaced by widespread recognition that their relationship, rather than representing a strategic vulnerability, actually demonstrated exactly the kind of authentic leadership and emotional resilience that had ultimately strengthened Draven's rule throughout a genuinely challenging period. Lady Vesna, true to her earlier promise, worked diligently to help coordinate the formal wedding celebrations, ensuring that allied pack leaders throughout the Northern Territories received proper invitations and understood the genuine political stability that Illyra's return and their formal marriage represented, rather than continuing to view their relationship through the lens of vulnerability or weakness that had characterized earlier political concerns. The wedding itself, held nearly 2 months after their emotional reunion in Fernbrook, brought together representatives from throughout the Northern Territories, including several pack leaders who had previously expressed significant reservations about Draven's judgment regarding his personal relationships. Watching these same leaders offer genuine congratulations and warm wishes for the couple's future happiness provided powerful confirmation of exactly how significantly circumstances had evolved throughout the preceding year. Myrna, given the honor of helping Illyra prepare for the ceremony, couldn't stop smiling throughout the entire process, her joy palpable as she helped arrange the final details of Illyra's wedding attire. "I always believed this day would eventually arrive," the older woman said, her eyes bright with happy tears, as she made final adjustments to Illyra's dress. "Despite everything that happened, despite the year of painful separation, I never lost faith that your love for each other would ultimately prevail. Your faith and support meant everything to me throughout this entire journey," Illyra replied warmly, embracing the woman who had become something akin to family throughout her complicated time within the castle walls. "Thank you for never giving up hope, even during the most difficult moments of uncertainty." As Illyra walked down the flower-strewn aisle toward Draven, who waited with obvious emotion and anticipation near the castle's grand hall, she found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought them to this significant moment. From her initial arrival as unwilling political tribute, dismissed to the smallest room in the entire castle, through the painful complications and eventual devastating separation that had tested their love beyond what either of them had believed possible, to this joyful reunion and formal commitment that represented the culmination of everything they had fought so desperately to protect and preserve. Draven's expression, as she finally reached him at the front of the assembled crowd, carried an intensity of love and joy that erased any lingering doubt about the genuine strength and resilience of their relationship. Whatever challenges they might face in their future together as king and queen, whatever political complications might occasionally arise given the complex responsibilities of leadership, Illyra understood with absolute certainty that they now possessed something far more powerful than external political calculations or strategic considerations. They possessed genuine, tested love, proven strong enough to survive an entire year of painful separation, powerful enough to ultimately transform political circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable, and resilient enough to promise a genuinely happy future together, regardless of whatever challenges their continued leadership of this northern kingdom might eventually present. As they exchanged their formal vows before the assembled crowd of allies, advisors, and castle staff who had witnessed their entire complicated journey, from unwilling political tribute to genuine, celebrated royal partnership, Illyra felt profound gratitude for every difficult experience that had ultimately led them to this moment of complete, unreserved happiness. The smallest room in the castle, once intended as a deliberate insult and political statement about her insignificant status, had ultimately become the unlikely birthplace of a love story powerful enough to survive political manipulation, dangerous conflict, and an entire year of devastating separation. That love now stood formally celebrated before their entire kingdom, a testament to the genuine power of authentic connection to overcome even the most seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As Draven finally kissed her, sealing their formal commitment before their assembled community, Illyra understood with complete certainty that whatever future challenges awaited them as king and queen of this northern territory, they would face those challenges together, their bond having already proven strong enough to withstand tests that would have destroyed lesser connections between two hearts. Their journey from unwilling tribute and cold political dismissal to celebrated royal partnership had been long, difficult, and marked by genuine sacrifice and painful separation. But standing together now, formally united before their entire kingdom, both Illyra and Draven understood that every difficult moment throughout their complicated journey had ultimately led them toward exactly the genuine, lasting happiness they both deeply deserved. The smallest room in the castle had given way to the grandest celebration their kingdom had witnessed in generations, and the year of painful searching had finally given way to a lifetime of promised partnership, genuine love, and the kind of authentic happiness that no political complication or external danger would ever again threaten to destroy. Their story, which had begun with such uncertain, painful circumstances, had finally found its rightful, joyful conclusion, proving that genuine love, when tested by even the most difficult circumstances, possesses the remarkable power to ultimately triumph over every obstacle placed in its path.